We'll go ahead and get started. First off, I'd like to thank all the COMSTAC members and also the special speakers that we have today. Thank you for your time, your energy, your effort, and taking time out for COMSTAC members, for you and your team to support the FAA and the Department of Transportation with great advice, recommendations, and observations. And your input is definitely appreciated. For our speakers, thank you for taking your time and providing that insight and information for the COMSTAC members as they deliberate some tasks and some questions that we've put to them. Next, this is a public meeting, so it is being broadcast live via FAA's YouTube channel and is being recorded. And finally, this meeting is being held pursuant to a notice published in the Federal Register on April 28th, 2023. The agenda for the meeting was announced in that notice, with details as set out in the agenda posted on the COMSTAC website. I'm the designated federal officer, James Hatt, from the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, and I am responsible for compliance with the Federal Advisory Committee Act, under which this meeting is conducted. It is my responsibility to see to it that the agenda is adhered to and that accurate minutes are kept. I also have the responsibility to adjourn the meeting should I find it necessary to do so in the public interest. Only Commercial Space Transportation Committee or COMSTAC members may participate in any discussions and vote on matters put to the vote by the chair. There are some updates to the agenda which have been posted. I have approved those changes at the request of the chair. So without any further delay, I would like to turn this over to the chair of COMSTAC, Karina Dries. Ma'am, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Jim. Welcome to the spring COMSTAC meeting. We do have a full agenda here today, and I look forward to hearing updates from working groups on their spring tasks. As I'm sure we'll hear from the AST personnel today, the industry has seen a significant increase in launches this past year to keep up with the demand for space services. The U.S. depends on space-based technology to bolster the economy, manage national security threats, and enable research of the Earth and its surrounding environment. The innovative commercial space sector is launching the space-based technology at an increasing pace, facilitated by the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation. We look forward to hearing from FAA leadership and learning more from them today. Please do feel free to ask questions of our speakers today. I'd like to turn it over to Vice Chair Mike French for some comments.
Thank you, Karina. I just wanted to give a thanks to the FAA AST team for supporting COMSTAC today's meeting, as well as my fellow COMSTAC members for taking the time over the last several weeks, if not months, to prepare for today's meeting and for what should be a good discussion today. It is pretty incredible the breadth of regulatory activity and potential regulatory activity that AST is facing at the moment that we're discussing today. There's quite a bit of attention on things like Part 450, its implementation, which we'll be talking about later this afternoon. But we're also going to have quite a bit of discussion on the learning period, as well as touch on other items where FAA is part of interagency discussions around things like mission authorization, as well as hope to get an update on several other regulatory areas such as orbital debris and other potential portions of the overall federal rulemaking enterprise that FAA AST has a part in. Of course, all this happens under increasingly constrained resources and a need for enough resources at AST to get those core licensing functions done. And so very much appreciate everyone's time to discuss these issues, given how many there are. I just think it's an incredibly important time for industry to share with AST what these changes mean or could mean, as well as reflect on how important resources are at this time. Thank you, Karina.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate that. Very well said. We are going to go ahead and get started since we have the administrator and associate administrator with us this morning. So it is my pleasure to welcome FAA's acting administrator, Billy Nolan. Administrator Nolan has been serving in this role since April 2022. He previously served as FAA's associate administrator for aviation safety. Administrator Nolan has over 33 years of experience in operations and corporate safety, regulatory affairs, and flight operations. He started his career as a pilot with American Airlines, followed by senior safety and operations roles at Airlines for America, Qantas Group, and WestJet before coming to serve as the leader at the FAA. Administrator Nolan is a graduate of Embry-Riddle, where he earned a degree in aviation management and has certificates in aviation safety from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, U.S. Army Safety Center, and the University of Southern California. Administrator Nolan, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Karina, and good morning, everybody. It's great to see our COMSTAC crew together again. And of course, we really appreciate your service. Your candid, informed feedback is vital to us as we develop policies, regulation. In short, we just need you guys to keep telling it like it is. As human space flight grows, it becomes more and more imperative to make sure the participants are safe. And as everyone here knows, the moratorium on human space flight regulation is set to expire on October 1st. We don't know if Congress will issue another extension, but in any case, we need to prepare for appropriate regulation. We're looking for honest, direct feedback from you about what lies ahead in the human space flight arena. And this will complement the work done by the Aviation Rulemaking Committee for Part 460, where industry will provide detailed recommendations on new human space flight safety framework. As I said, we really need you to tell it like it is. We want to hear about what's working, what's not working, and what we haven't yet thought of, and what we need to think about going forward. Another challenge we're grappling with, as Mike spoke to, is authorization and supervision of novel space activities. Things like asteroid mining, refueling satellites, space hotels, and even bigger things that some visionaries are dreaming about. We're in ongoing discussions with our interagency colleagues, the National Space Council's staff, and the Transportation Secretary's office on how to efficiently and safely enable these kind of missions in a sustainable manner. But whether there are humans on board or not, we know that space operations will continue to increase. You can imagine how crowded and complex our airspace will get. We're looking at more than 100 space launches every year. Factor on top of that the rise of electric air taxis and, of course, traditional aviation. We're going to have to maximize airspace efficiency and make sure all safety needs are met. And this means we need to communicate and coordinate with space operators alongside all other airspace users. We're eager to hear your feedback and input on how we can do our best here. And with a growing industry comes the need for a growing workforce. We must attract and develop highly skilled employees that reflect the diversity of the nation. I was happy to see that the 4-person crew for Artemis 2 includes a woman and a person of color. But frankly, that's not enough. We need to see more diversity through every level of the aerospace industry, commercial or otherwise. When you have people from a wide range of backgrounds who can bring a wide range of perspectives to the table, you get better decision-making, more innovation, and a higher degree of safety. So we're eager to hear your report today on creative ways to recruit the next generation aerospace workforce and ways to partner with industry on this critical effort. As you know, as I think about young people starting their careers in this field, I get a bittersweet feeling. I think back to my own career when I started by stepping into a small helicopter in the U.S. Army to start what then became a lifelong journey in aviation. As you know, I'll be leaving the agency over the summer, so this will be my last COMSTAC meeting. I have valued the opportunity to work with you, and I look forward to seeing how the agency's space transportation policy develops in the month and years ahead. Again, thank you to everyone for your service, and please have a productive meeting. And with that, Karina, back to you.
Thank you so much, Administrator Nolan, for those remarks. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us this morning. Next, it's my pleasure to welcome FAA's Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation, Mr. Kelvin Coleman. Mr. Coleman is responsible for ensuring the achievement of AST's mission to oversee and enable the safest commercial space transportation system in the world. He has more than 25 years of leadership experience in AST, serving in various roles, most recently as Deputy Associate Administrator. Prior to joining AST, Mr. Coleman worked for NavAir as both a systems engineer and as a guidance, navigation, and control engineer for several weapon systems and acquisition programs. Mr. Coleman holds a bachelor's degree in electronics and computer engineering from George Mason University and an MBA from Marymount University. Associate Administrator Coleman, thank you so much for your AST leadership and for joining us here today. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Karina, for that introduction. And good morning and to all of our COMSTAC members. And of course, thank you for your service. This is our first meeting of 2023, and we look really to kick this off with a bang, if you will, and have a great meeting today. Certainly the breadth of experience, knowledge, and perspective within this committee, I have to say, is truly exceptional. At the FAA, we really appreciate certainly your commitment to the commercial space transportation sector and the time and the talent that each of you bring to this committee. We know that together we can tackle the common issues that impact us all. It's been 4 months since we last met, and in a short period of time, AST has accomplished quite a bit, I think, that I want to share with you today. But before I do that, I want to do a couple of things. One, I want to just say that we just heard from our acting administrator, Billy Nolan, and he did mention that this summer that he will be departing the FAA. And I want to say publicly that his leadership at the FAA has been exemplary. His support of AST and commercial space has been outstanding. And we certainly have appreciated his leadership in those areas, and we will certainly miss him as he departs and turns the page into a next phase for himself and his family. Secondly, I want to mention here that we made some significant personnel moves in AST, and one of which I want to highlight up front, and that is that I made the selection of Michael J. O'Donnell to serve as our Deputy Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation at the FAA. Some of you who've had the opportunity to meet Michael know that he's for the past year has served as our acting Deputy Associate Administrator, and has done an outstanding job at that. Mike brings a great wealth of executive experience to the post. Those of you who've had the opportunity to meet Mike, you know he brings a collegial and collaborative attitude and disposition to the work that he's doing for us. And we really look forward to his contributions moving forward in this very critical role as a Deputy Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation. He's a veteran of the FAA. He's been around for a little while, having served in aviation safety, accident investigation, and the Office of Airports in the past. So he has a very great experience and a long experience in the agency. And we look forward to Michael making more contributions for commercial space moving forward. Now, as I mentioned, we've accomplished, I think, a great bit to start the year. I just want to start off, as I typically do, with some statistics. So far through April of this year, we had 31 launches and 2 reentries, and just compare that to what we had last year at this time. 19 launches and 1 reentry. So we already have doubled the pace this year where we were last year. And we've helped at least a number of companies, I won't enumerate them, but we've helped a number of companies move their products to market. Relativity Space with their launch of the Terran 1 vehicle, SpaceX with the launch of the Starship Super Heavy, ABL Space Systems with the launch of their MS-1 demo mission. Were all exceptional missions, if you will, and the fact that they were conducted, these were mostly test missions, although all of them ended in mishaps. Most importantly, none of these missions encountered serious injuries or fatalities to the public, which is what our goal is really here in the AST, is to ensure that the public is protected during the course of these operations. Now, mishaps, as we know, is a part of this business. It's not unusual to see a mishap occur from time to time. As fact, most new vehicle operations have a mishap of some sort during their first one or two operations. We currently have 6 mishap investigations underway right now. We're working very closely with those companies to understand what the root causes of those mishaps were. And I should mention, during these mishaps, it's not all bad. There's a lot that can be learned during the course of a mishap. Certainly the companies learn a lot, and we, the regulator, also learn a lot during mishaps. We want to understand, how our analyses panned out. Did the vehicle fail as we expected it to fail? If it didn't fail in the manner in which we expected it to fail, well, why not? And how do we close the gap in that delta to make sure we have accurate predictions moving forward and we can better serve the public? So we will continue to work very closely with the companies that have the mishap investigations underway. We have a great partnership, not only with our government partners, but also with the industry. We work very closely with the NTSB, NASA, the Defense Department, and others who typically are observers doing these investigations. And so we will look very closely at these and, of course, get to the root cause of these investigations and make sure going forward that we have the appropriate mitigations in place to address the risks to the public that are posed by these operations. So far, so good. We've had 600 plus of these operations under our belt, none of which have impacted the public. And we certainly want to keep that record intact moving forward, and we expect to do so. Now, I'll turn a little bit and talk about some things that are happening internal to AST. I think, as Mike mentioned in his opening comments, of course, we are challenged as we see a greater demand in for our products and services, licenses and inspections and research and other things that we're doing to support the industry. At the beginning of the year, we were fortunate enough to get an appropriation of a little north of $5 million, which is very helpful to us. We were also authorized to hire up to 40 additional staff. Looking at affordability, we won't be able to bring on up to 40, but we'll be able to bring on about half of that number, maybe a little bit more than half of that number. Our target this year is to get to 155 staff on board. We're currently at about 130. So we have about 25 more to go, and we're making good progress there. We're bringing on aerospace engineers with experience in flight safety, system safety. We're also bringing on additional staff members to help us in the arena of human spaceflight as well, just to name a few areas that we're working on. So we're making good progress there, and certainly we want to get to that 155 as soon as we can, so we can continue to keep pace with the demand for the products and services that are so important to this industry. Speaking of which, one of those products obviously is our licensing work, and we'll hear from Dan Murray a little later about some of the things that are going on there. But one thing I will highlight is the fact that we continue to work on a licensing evaluation application portal, which we hope will make things much easier for applicants coming in the door. That procurement now is in its final stages. We hope to have a contract in place by September of this year to get that moving forward in a very positive manner. We've revamped our complete enough policy. I know in years past, complete enough has been a bit of an ambiguous pursuit by many in the industry, but we've tried to take some of the ambiguity out of that by making the complete enough determination more of a quantitative determination versus qualitative determination. There are still some qualitative elements to it, but it's mostly a quantitative assessment now that we do with respect to making a complete enough determination. And we think that will help move things along at an appropriate clip. And again, Dan Murray will have more to say about that here shortly. We continue to do great work, I believe, in partnership with NASA and the DoD in the arena of LOX methane research and investigation. We all understand the importance of being able to characterize LOX methane such that we can make the appropriate calls from a public safety standpoint as this propellant is becoming more prominent in utilization within the industry. So that's a very important piece of work that we're undergoing right now with the industry, as well as our government partners. So that's moving forward. It was mentioned that we have a couple of new sparks, as we call them, aerospace rulemaking committees, the first of which was kicked off just last week. The Part 440 spark on financial responsibility. The plan is to run this spark for a couple of years. So we'll probably wrap up sometime in calendar year 2024. And what this spark will do is provide us consensus recommendations on how we might go about improving our maximum probable loss determinations, modernizing the financial responsibility requirements, and helping us really understand how to create a responsible reciprocal waiver of claims regime. Karen Shinnerwork is the industry co-chair leading this effort, along with Jim Hatt, who is chairing it from the government side. So we look for a great outcome from that committee, and we certainly appreciate both Karen and Jim's leadership of that committee. Secondly, we also have a Part 460 spark on commercial human spaceflight. This one was just chartered. It's not quite underway yet, but it will be here shortly. When it does kick off, this particular spark will focus on a new safety framework on how we might best move human spaceflight occupant safety from an informed consent regime, which is currently under, to a performance-based safety regime for the future. So we really look forward to this spark getting underway. Min Nguyen, some of you know, will be the government co-chair for this spark. And like the 440 spark, we expect this particular spark to run for the better part of 2 years. So we really look forward to the industry's recommendations on topics that are really relevant and ready to be established in a new regime to not only keep the public, but also the spacefaring public safe as well. On the aerospace integration piece, we'll hear from Dwayne Freer later on today. I won't steal his thunder, but we are working very closely with our air traffic organization, as we have for several years now, on how to best support and engage and to integrate commercial space transportation operations into the national airspace system. I have a very close working relationship with the Chief Operating Officer of the FAA, Chief Tim Morrell, who runs the air traffic organization. And Tim gets it. I will say he really understands the need to balance the equities of all of the users in the NAS, and he's very focused on doing that. So I look forward to hearing Dwayne's presentation later today, where he'll speak about some things that we've had to say publicly, most recently about airspace optimization. Now, just turning to the future a little bit here as I close, we heard Billy talk a little bit about human spaceflight, and of course, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what will happen here at the end of the fiscal year as the moratorium faces sunset. Well, whether it will sunset or whether it will be extended, we don't know. But in the meantime, we've thought it best that we not sit on our hands, that we begin to do the necessary work to prepare for the eventuality of regulation of human spaceflight. As I've said in the past, we don't have a drawer full of regulations ready to go, far from it. We'll look to the spark that I just mentioned to give us and share with us their recommendations. But in the meantime, we'll continue to do some of the important work that we've been doing along the way, such as working with the industry-led F-47 committee and ASTM that's looking at voluntary consensus standards for commercial space transportation, including standards for commercial human spaceflight. We'll continue to commit resources to support that effort and to help that effort move along. We've also continued to update our recommended practices for human spaceflight occupant safety, which we published several years ago. It's undergoing a much deserved and needed update. And we look to have that update concluded a little later this year. So that's great work going on there. And then, of course, I mentioned the sparkers already. That'll be an important piece too. So that's the three-legged stool as I look at it for commercial human spaceflight: the spark work, the recommended practices, and the industry standards. I think will really help us become, and I say us, that's the collective us, be better informed as what the appropriate steps are next for commercial human spaceflight. Now I'll mention lastly here the AST mission. I think most of you all know our mission and are very familiar with it, but we've done some streamlining of our mission statement lately, and I want to share with you our new mission statement, which simply is to enable safe space transportation. I'll say that again: to enable safe space transportation, and the action word there is to enable. We understand and appreciate the importance that commercial space transportation has to our nation and our economic well-being, our national security needs, our civil space needs. And we understand where we sit in that equation. And AST is committed and focused on enabling this very important industry moving forward. And we want to do that, obviously, in a safe manner, with safety being our North Star. So we look forward to doing that. We look forward to continuing to work with this committee, with this industry, as we move this industry forward and as we continue to enable safe space transportation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Associate Administrator. We really appreciate it. Appreciate you being here with us today. And, you know, a lot of these comments that you made definitely resonate with this particular group and with the larger industry. So it's very welcome and very timely. I am going to turn it over to Jim to introduce the next round of speakers and facilitate the Q&A. I just wanted to mention quickly for folks, you are welcome to keep your cameras on. I apologize for the confusion at the very beginning of the meeting, but you're definitely welcome to keep your cameras on. You can treat this as if we were in an in-person room. So Jim, over to you.
All right, thank you. And before we get started into kind of the AST updates, I want to mention to all the COMSTAC members, if during these briefings, Dan or Brian Rushforth or Dwayne Freer or others, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the raise your hand at the bottom, or you can type your questions into the chat feature, and I will make sure that we get those questions to the speaker. So please feel free to ask questions while you're going through this or while you're listening. The first person is Dan Murray, the Executive Director, Office of Operational Safety here at the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. And Dan will be speaking about licensing updates. Dan, sir, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I believe Mike has his hand up, though.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Dan. I just didn't know if we were going to have any questions to Kelvin before we jumped into Dan here.
Kelvin is still on, so sure.
And I thought I got away, Mike. Thank
no
you.
way, I wasn't going to let you. You looked too happy for a moment there. Well, so I'll kick it off then. Thank you so much for the overview. And since your team is going to be diving into a lot of the issues within AST, maybe I'll have one that's more interagency focused. Is there anything more you can tell us on the status of the mission authorization activity? I'd say for my part, particularly concerned that we may be creating here an additional regulatory regime well beyond what's needed to meet international obligations. And I think any update you could provide would be welcome.
Sure. Yeah. I didn't talk about that in my comments, but mission authorization, I think we all understand, or at least many of us understand, the importance of us figuring an appropriate, transparent, some would say relatively light touch way forward on mission authorization. I will say that the interagency has been hard at work trying to figure this out, and I think is pretty close to an end game with respect to what an appropriate approach would look like moving forward. I can say from the Department of Transportation's standpoint, Deputy Secretary Trottenberg has been very much engaged. She's attentive to the issue and has been having great conversations with her counterparts, Deputy Administrator Melroy at NASA, as well as Deputy Secretary Graves at Commerce. There's been great conversations going on there, obviously with the Office of the Vice President, as well as the Executive Secretary of Space Council, Chirag Parikh. So, I can't disclose much beyond that, Mike, other than to say there's progress being made. And I think that there's been a lot of thought put into this. I think soon there will be an unveiling of where things stand. But to your point, there is no interest in creating a burdensome, duplicative regulatory regime that doesn't serve anybody's needs on the government side or industry side. So without getting into a whole lot of details, I will say I think it's on a good course moving forward, and I'm sure that more will be said here shortly.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Karen.
Thank you so much, and good morning. And Kelvin, thank you for the start of the Part 440 Spark. We certainly are excited to get to work on that, and really appreciate the great group of people that you have gathered to work on that problem together with Jim Hatt. A follow-up question on the Article 6 mission authorization question, which is, are you seeing an increased number of payload reviews come in relative to that issue? Because it does seem as though many of those activities are currently flowing through the FCC. So I'm curious as to what kind of workload you're seeing relative to payload reviews for activities that would be considered non-traditional activities. And then I also want to ask about the orbital debris rule, also relative to the FCC, I guess, but it doesn't have to be, because we've heard about an orbital debris rule for a while now. So I'm curious if we're going to get an update on that today, or if you can just give us one really quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start with the second question first. So the orbital debris rule is moving forward on our side. It's making its way soon to OMB, and then we'll certainly vet it out to the interagency to have its review there. But it's making progress. So there will be, I expect to see an orbital debris NPRM from us, hopefully by the fall, is my goal. Hopefully we'll see that happen. And as you mentioned, that we know there's a lot going on with the FCC in that arena as well. So, we'll see how things work out there. To your first question with respect to an increase in volume of payload determinations that relate to the mission authorization piece, I'll ask Dan to maybe speak to that. Dan, can you talk to what you're seeing with respect to an increase for perhaps standalone payload reviews as relates to the mission authorization issue?
Sure. We have not seen a sharp increase in requests for independent payload reviews. We are actually looking to move toward a process that we'll be discussing with some of our operators to encourage more payload reviews to take place out of the licensing or out of the launch flow, I guess I should say, but for different reasons. I would say the majority of the independent payload reviews that we are dealing with now that are non-traditional are nuclear.
Did that help, Karen?
Yeah, that is. And I would love to actually hear more about the nuclear piece there too. I think that's something that some of us are interested in.
I believe we may need to put
Thank
that
you.
for the next meeting. But I will tell you from the policy division, which I run, we are working on an advisory circular that will address that issue. So more is coming, just not quite ready for prime time yet. All right, Mariba.
How's it going? Can people hear me?
Yes, sir.
Booyah. So look, good morning, everybody. Great to see everyone. Thank you so much, Calvin, for all the things that you said. One thing that is a bit of an unsolicited question here is, as we move forward with all the things you said and the things that the FAA needs to do, it strikes me as relevant to at least bring up that the FAA did have this Center of Excellence for Commercial Space Transportation that brought in researchers and academics to really help out with many of the needs of the FAA under George. And it's clear to me now more than ever that the COE for commercial space transportation was probably ahead of its time. And so I guess my question is, given where all these interagency kind of works are going towards orbital safety, security, and sustainability, is there an appetite, do you feel, for the FAA to, resurrect the COE for commercial space transportation to help augment some of the works that other agencies are trying to do kind of in this endeavor? Because I don't see Commerce or anybody else standing up something like the COE for commercial space transportation, and space traffic management was one of the pillars that was meant to be addressed by the COE CST.
Yeah. So thanks for that question, Marie. But Dr. Jha, I don't expect to see that we will resurrect the COE in its past form. I think we will have something, a different framework in place with similar objectives. We talked about a research alliance that we're continuing to work on. We understand the importance of having a broad community of researchers come together to do both basic and applied research, and we will continue to push on that. The COE did serve us exceptionally well, as you stated, and perhaps it was ahead of its time. But moving forward, we won't abandon the principles there, but we will look to perhaps manifest it a bit differently moving forward. So we'll continue to work on that piece.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no other questions, Dan, back to you.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to address the COMSTAC today. Our licensing process remains at a very high demand across all phases, from pre-application to operations. I reported back in February at our conference that at that time we had a steady workload of about 7 applications that were in evaluation, another 10 or so in pre-application consultation, and another 30 or so in what we call early pre-app or initial discussions. While we have granted 2 licenses, 2 450 licenses since February, we've just turned to the next applicant in line who has been waiting for our attention. We note that a number of companies have been waiting on us lately. So I'd like to use this time today to speak to a few of the steps we've taken lately to keep the process moving, to be as efficient as possible in our work, and to minimize the amount of time that an applicant waits on us to get their application material reviewed. Kelvin touched on this a little bit earlier in the form of our complete enough policy, and I'll speak to that in a moment, as well as some additional policies we're implementing for tolling and denying applications. Our licensing process begins with initial discussions, which can take the form of a few short meetings for an applicant to provide us with a high-level overview of their plans, and for us to provide the applicant with a high-level overview of the application and evaluation processes. We encourage companies to contact us directly through our website, where you can fill out a form that provides some basic details. This facilitates a productive first meeting. At the initial discussion, we encourage companies to provide us with the concept of operation at a more detailed level of what they intend to do. We provide something called a project overview planning tool, which asks a number of questions of a new applicant to help us get to some of the issues that could become challenging, particularly schedule-wise, as we work through the process. These are new and innovative ways of doing things, new means of compliance that haven't been proposed before, things like that that we would denote as having what we call a high regulatory risk, to include schedule risk. It's in your best interest as an applicant, of course, to carefully review the countouts that you provide to us and identify those risks and raise them to our attention. We have a lot of experience in doing this, of course, but we won't necessarily catch everything, particularly in these early discussions. But the more we can get out on the table and talk to earlier on, the better off we all are. Once the key aspects of the countouts have been shared, we move into a formal pre-application consultation. At this point, we strongly encourage all of our applicants, regardless of your licensing experience, to use our website to find guidance, checklists, and other assistance in developing your application. This includes the advisory circulars. Please read the advisory circulars. We can generally tell when you haven't. And they do contain some very useful information. In the past, we've created some large pre-app teams to work step by step with a company through the development of their application. We'll no longer be working this way, as we don't have enough resources to have so many teams. We'll be available to answer questions, but pre-app will no longer take the form of a large series of largely attended meetings. We'll continue to update our website with guidance, and we'll continue to provide workshops in similar forums. When you're ready to apply, we'll provide you with a checklist to use in ensuring your application upon its formal submittal is complete enough to be accepted. We'll use this same checklist to make our acceptance determination. We cannot accept an application until we have accepted your means of compliance in 450.35, regardless of the state of the completeness of the rest of the material. The acceptance of your 450.35 means of compliance, in particular, the flight safety analysis methodology means of compliance in 450.115 is a major licensing milestone. Our experience has shown that it can take months for an applicant to develop and receive approval of these sections based on the scope of the application, the amount of material required in these requirements, and the level of detail in the documentation. We continue to hold our flight safety analysis methodology office hours every other Friday. We just did one this past Friday. We encourage applicants at all phases of the process to attend these office hours and submit questions in advance for consideration. You not only gain the benefit of getting your questions answered, you get to hear what other questions are being asked by other people in other phases of the process who can give you an idea of where you've been and where you need to go still as you make your way through the process. After we accept your means of compliance, we'll make a quantitative determination as to whether or not we can accept your application and begin our evaluation. So as Kelvin mentioned before, this is a bit of a change in approach than we've used traditionally. We'll use a checklist to do this that we'll have provided you in advance, and we'll look for you to fill out the checklist to demonstrate that you've addressed each applicable regulation. When our electronic application portal comes online, this is a function we expect to be largely automated. It's not a check of the quality of the information that comes in. That comes later. It's a check that the information that we are expecting to see is there. So it lends itself to automation. It lends itself to a very quick turnaround that we can provide feedback on, particularly if we find information is missing. Now, as before, the application does not have to be 100% complete for us to accept it. It can be complete enough for allow us to do a meaningful review. And at that time, we'll recognize and identify information that's missing, and we'll put together a schedule for which we would expect to receive that information based on your plans to continue through the licensing process and our ability to complete our evaluation in the time we're given. So to summarize at this point in particular, complete enough is not a review of the quality of the submission, just its quantity. So we expect it to be very straightforward and relatively quick. And we highly encourage the use of the checklists of the other materials to make sure that your information is arranged correctly, that it's internally consistent, and that it's well organized. Our goal is to keep the process moving. We spend the majority of our time reviewing your application material and providing you with written feedback. We found that large meetings to step through application materials are not the best use of our time or your time. We prefer to meet in smaller groups of subject matter experts to discuss our written feedback after we have provided it to you. So there's lots of opportunities to ask questions and have dialogue, but we find the most useful time to do that is after you have provided us with material, we have provided you with feedback, and we can discuss both your material and our feedback in a meeting with our subject matter experts. In our review, if we find application materials missing, we will toll the review period. And we will not wait to toll your application. So if we find it's missing, we will contact you. We will let you know that we were tolling your application, and we will talk to you about a schedule by which you can provide us with that information. We will not leave licenses tolled indefinitely. There will be a set period of time in which the information will come in. If the information does not come in that set period of time, we can then at that point deny the application. Again, to keep the application process moving, and to allow us to engage with each application as we receive it, we will not endlessly iterate on the materials to achieve the appropriate scope and level of detail of submission. If after a small number of reviews, we find your accepted application is too incomplete or inconsistent to demonstrate compliance, we will deny it. You will be provided with specific written feedback on its deficiencies, and we will then turn our attention to the next application that is ready for our review. In summary, we're focusing on complete enough tolling and denial as tools at our disposal to address some of the issues we've encountered and managing the workload. We've implemented these policies to ensure consistency across all projects. And again, our goal is to keep the process moving, to be as efficient as possible, and to minimize the amount of time that an applicant has to wait on us to get their application material reviewed. A few other quick points to make on what makes a good application from the FAA's perspective. Some of these I've touched on in the past. Less is not more. A lot of the iterating we do is about getting to the appropriate level of detail. So starting at a high level is generally not the best place to start. We encourage you to dig in and get to the details from the get-go. Use the guidance. We can't say this enough. We spend a lot of time developing guidance in the form of advisory circulars, workshop materials, checklists, and other materials. They're all out there for your benefit. They're all available on our website. We've done some things to the website to make it easier to navigate. We recognized in the past it was a little difficult to find some of the things that we thought were most useful. We look for feedback from you on how easy it is to find what you're looking for and how well the information we're putting out there is helping you do what you're trying to do. We want feedback on all of our rules, on all of our guidance. We have plans to update 450. We want your lessons learned. We will be using our lessons learned to do that. We have a running list of watch items with regard to 450 that we are looking at. And so as companies move through the process and complete it themselves, we want your input to help us hone the rule as we can iteratively as we go through the future. We encourage you to start early and give yourself time to build the application as your plans become more solid to prevent redoing work on both our end and your end, particularly with regard to the environmental. The old approach of let's get the environmental done first is not really in anyone's best interest. The environmental has to reflect what the rest of the application says and vice versa. We have found ourselves in a number of areas, particularly recently, where there's an inconsistency between what's in the environmental review and what's in the rest of the application. And at some point, that happens after the environmental review has been completed. That means we have to go back and redo work. That moves us back into the process, and it eats away at a lot of time, particularly when the schedule risk is high. We want you to think carefully about the scope of what you're applying for and discuss options with us. And finally, do your own quality control. We recognize that application materials are voluminous. They are hundreds or even thousands of pages. There are going to be issues and errors and missing links and things like that. It's inevitable with that amount of material that's being shared between our organization and your organization. But to the degree that you could review the material rigorously and ensure that it is organized well and internally consistent before you share it with us, makes the most of our time and ultimately makes the most of your time. So that is the state of our licensing process and some of the steps that we're looking to take. We do have some workshops and other forums that we are planning for later this year. We did one on system safety a little while ago. We're going to have a workshop on flight safety analysis coming up here in the next few months. We're going to have another one on compliance and enforcement. We are open to suggestions on workshops. We are open to suggestions and feedback on our office hours. We could see expanding the scope of those beyond flight safety analysis, although judging from the level of activity we've had there, that's still an area that requires a significant amount of focus. So overall, we look forward to hearing from your licensing teams. We look forward to hearing from you as you work through the process, and we look forward to keeping the process moving and being as efficient as we can. Thank you.
Karina.
I'd love to ask a quick question. I know we're running a little bit behind schedule, but I do need to ask this question. I feel like probably most of the folks here on COMSTAC are going to be less impacted by this change in process than some of the newer companies that are coming online. And I completely understand why you all are having to do this to try to conserve resources. It takes a long time to get sort of new companies up to speed on this. But I am kind of curious, having some, experience with this in the past in Mojave, you all had quarterly meetings that you would hold with new applicants, which kind of helped to provide some guidance along the way. Do you still expect some level of check-in with these new applicants along the way, or is it sort of like you're just going to wait for them to come and ask you questions once they have something to deliver? Do you think the quarterly meetings will continue?
They will. They'll perhaps be a little more targeted and focused than what they have been in the past. We held a series of them. The Mojave meetings are one example, but we've held others. We find that the face-to-face interaction between our subject matter experts and your subject matter experts is a good use of time if we can plan for it appropriately and scope the agenda. So we do anticipate continuing to do those, but they would be in a more focused fashion, perhaps, than we were before. We got away from doing that, obviously, during COVID. We did some of it virtually. We're looking to do more of it in person and make the most of that time.
All right, Megan.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Meg.
Appreciate the information you just shared. I wanted to ask how you guys plan to assess whether or not these improvements are working. So do you have metrics that you're going to be watching to see if these are making an impact and they're benefiting the industry?
We do. We have some basic metrics that we've identified in terms of capturing our throughput into the different types of authorizations that we're working through, getting those to determination, how long it takes us, how many resources it's taking us, those sorts of things. We're in the process of formulating a business plan goal for next fiscal year that will cement those metrics into a working set that we use year after year to gauge our progress. We'll, of course, reflect on them much more frequently than that, but we'll have a business plan target that speaks to those. And that'll be out for everyone to see, not only the target itself, but also our progress toward those metrics. So we look forward to having that next fiscal year. Back quickly to one comment that Karina made that I kind of missed before we get to Karen. I appreciate the point you made, Karina, and agree that a lot of our experienced operators are not as directly affected by these policies as the newer applicants might be. But you are indirectly affected in that the time we spend on other applicants is time that we are not spending on your application or your modification or your request for waiver or the material updates that periodically come in. We have standing teams for all of the companies that have licenses and that fly frequently, but we still have to borrow resources across those teams to take on the new application. So moving the application work, keeping it moving, allows us to turn our attention in all the different places it needs to be, including to our experienced license operators who are operating more frequently. Karen.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks for walking through that. I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I heard was that in many cases you're having to work not entirely in series, one applicant at a time, because you do have standing teams that work with licensees and with applicants. But it does sound like it's maybe 2 tracks of parallel, not 8 tracks of parallel. So I get the feeling, as you indicated, that there people have to be in a queue. So you turn to another applicant after you've either finished or had to deny one or move them into a toll. And so could you kind of give us a sense of what does it look like in terms of staffing, resources? Kelvin spoke to the number of employees targeting 155, currently 130. What is the delta there between being able to operate in an optimized manner would actually dealing with applicants as they come in the door and effectively and efficiently working through those so as to maybe never again have a launch vehicle on a pad waiting for a license? What does that look like? What in terms of, is it pure staffing? What is that to solve? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. It's definitely staffing. Right now, the emphasis is on flight safety analysis. That is the place where nearly all of our applications struggle to get through the means of compliance. We are working on doubling our staff there. Of the new positions that Kelvin mentioned, a significant number of them are flight safety analysts, experienced flight safety analysts. There's not a lot of places in the world to find people with that background and experience. So we have done our best to lure some folks away from some of our partners. At the same time, we're going to be doing some extensive training to build up the skills in some of our junior folks to get them in a more experienced method. At that point, we could have as many as 3 times as the analysts that we currently have once we get all of our hiring spots filled and all of our folks trained up. But that'll obviously take a while. Personnel is a big part of it. The other part of it, though, is automation. The licensing evaluation portal that was mentioned earlier, we see that as a game changer in terms of application processing. It would help us hone in on the aspects of the application that need our attention most. It'll automate a lot of things that we currently do manually. It will assist in organizing the files and making sure that they're internally consistent. And it will expedite reviews. Things will move from person to person as they need to when we do work in series in an automated fashion. So we see the application portal, the personnel, and the training of the personnel as the big things here to help us keep up. At the same time, though, we are looking to the industry to, particularly as current operators transition to Part 450, take more advantage of the things that 450 offers in terms of scoping the applications to cover a larger number of operations, and in doing so, reduce the number of modifications we have to work. There are obviously new customers that come along with new requirements that require you to modify your vehicle or the way you operate, or even move to a new site. Those things are inevitable. But there's a lot of mission by mission approval we are still doing with a large number of modifications across the board that we would see opportunities in 450 to address, that we would put the time in up front to evaluate a broader envelope of the types of operations, the different specifications, and then we would just simply see from mission to mission that they fit in the envelope and move on, as opposed to processing modifications. So that will be a significant change that we look to the industry to take full advantage of 450 on to really realize that.
And Dan, just real quickly, would you mind giving a kind of sense of what your time frame is? Like, do you think that by the time we have this call a year from now, the trainings, the hiring, assuming you can find the people, will be done, and you'll be reporting on a significant pace increase? Or do you think this is a 5-year problem?
Overall, it's a 5-year problem, but I would say a year from now, we should have some significant progress to report out on. Yes. As Calvin mentioned, we should have our procurement of the portal by the end of this fiscal year. So we expect to be able to report on its development in the near future. Our 155 people are going to be on board by the end of the fiscal year. And in particular with the skill sets we were talking about that we're really focusing in on. So we should have some significant progress to report, but it'll be a multi-year effort to get where we need to be.
Yeah, I was going to jump in here and say, certainly from my perspective, I'm looking to see short-term returns on this. As Dan said, it's a long-term process, but I do want to see short-term returns on this. We're really trying to open the aperture here. We really must do that. We really have to increase our bandwidth to do multiple things at once, if you will. We're certainly going to place more responsibility and accountability on the laps of industry, if you will, with respect to coming in the door with good applications. I use the analogy all the time internally, and I'll just use it here publicly. I mean, we're going to be in the business of calling balls and strikes with applications. I mean, when an application comes in, we oftentimes get pressed to turn us on. Well, we will turn the application on. You know, if the material is there, we will turn it on and start the clock, and we will evaluate it. And when we get into the evaluation, we will call balls and strikes, if you will. So that's what we think we need to be, where we need to be moving forward in the future, particularly as we see the growth. Of course, I've said this again and again, in the demand for our products and services. It won't be sustainable to do things the way that we've done them for the past decade. Just not sustainable moving forward. So we're making this move really to best serve the industry and to move things at the pace of industry.
All right. Any other questions for Dan? If not, Dwayne Freer is the manager for ATO Space Operations. Dan, I'll turn it over to you if you would, please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Jim. Can you hear me okay? Just wanted
Yes.
to quality check. Okay. I'd like to talk this morning a little bit about our NASA integration efforts within the ATO. We've made significant progress over the last 5 years in integrating operations. I have a PowerPoint, Jim, and I'm not sure if I need to share or whether it's going to be shared by the
John should be bringing it up here momentarily.
Okay, fantastic. So last month, really encouraged by the fact that the agency produced some guidelines for integration of operations. That document really supported of a lot of our existing efforts. What I really was encouraged on there is the support of the integration and collaborative environment that we established. The collaboration was an important part of the Airspace Access Priorities ARC and the CDM process, so that the guidelines that were issued really came out and supported that, as well as some other efforts. I'll run through some slides real briefly here just to level set where we are and what we're doing. We've updated this over the weekend. I believe we're at 41 missions now for this calendar year, but of course, it's no surprise to anybody, as Kelvin mentioned, the rapid increase and cadence increase that we've seen. Next slide. And our focus really is on Florida as we move forward. The guidelines that came out, I was encouraged by the language in there that there's no single factor that's going to influence the approval or the evaluation of missions as we move forward. It's really a very fine-tuned approach that we're taking, and the focus really is on Florida as we move forward. I'm going to show you some of the stats on that if you'll go to the next slide. So historically, November to April of the year is what we call snowbird season, and it's very high volume in the Florida and the Caribbean market. Beginning in December 21, as we came out of COVID, we saw a very discernible shift in the aviation market and the requests by the customers of the aviation community that shifted the travel patterns and accentuated that volume in Florida and the Caribbean. That's an interesting shift in the market, and one we'll be tracking over the coming years, but it further accentuated the need to focus on Florida and the integration efforts there. Launch demand at the Cape, you can see that in the lower right-hand corner. No surprise to anybody that grew quite significantly. And one of the concerns from the aviation community that's been shared within the CDM process is scrub launches. So we've definitely got to focus on managing scrubs, and we've made some very good progress over the last months using our CDM process to further look into that. Next slide. Here's some graphs that show 2022 activity. No surprise to anybody, 64% of all the activity within the NAS is generated by missions from Cape Canaveral or Kennedy Space Center. What is interesting is 64% of the activities there, but 92% of the effect to the aviation community is generated by those activities. So disproportionate amount. That's no surprise because the level of activity, but also the volume of aviation traffic in the Florida area and Caribbean that we just talked about. So that further accentuates that 92% is why we're focused on Florida, because that is really the meat of the problem or the meat of the challenge that we have. Now, that being said, as we look at other launch locations, we don't have the same constraints. So what I'd like to impress on everybody is that really that individual approach, that individual analysis, in the lack of a broad brush approach. So each launch location, each mission will be individually evaluated and looked at and collaborated with our partners. Next slide. Here's all the efforts over the last 5 years to integrate missions into the NAS. And we've shaved NAS impact or airway closures, airspace closures from 4 hours to sometimes 2 hours. Nominal missions that go on time, and we've looked at the on time. Most of the missions, I believe it's around 75 to 80% of missions go within the first 10 minutes of the intended T0. So very good performance there. And we're releasing airspace as soon as 3 minutes after the launch by use of the hotlines and the SDI and the other things you see on there. One thing I would like to call out is in the middle there is critical decision windows. That's an effort through our collaborative decision-making process to address the scrubs that are such a concern in Florida. What we've done there is we've encouraged operators when they're able to make that decision before traffic management initiatives are placed into the NAS. So that scrub decisions in a lot of cases is coming well before the NAS is impacted. So we really appreciate the collaboration on that and the positive movement we've made on that. On the next slide, you'll see over 54%, it's over 50% of the missions have the scrub decision has been made before that collaborative decision window. So that's a really encouraging sign, something that's really hitting home with our aviation partners, that we are making positive progress, even on scrub missions, to mitigate the impacts of that. And again, that came out of our collaborative decision-making group there, and a really positive step forward. Next slide. Another item of interest, we've made really good progress on the airspace closures. One thing that we've noticed over the years is a lot of the airspace that's been delegated for missions were there to capture the totality of the launch azimuths from a particular location. In this slide, you can see on the top right-hand corner is the Cape's traditional airspace activation. In green is what we affectionately call the clamshell. That's a TFR that limits some of the use of the airspace. It was designed decades ago to encapsulate all the launch azimuths, possible launch azimuths out of the Cape. What we've worked with SLED 45 and our partners on is actually shaving that down, taking a finer pencil to that. And what you see there on the bottom right, we're actually now only activating part of that clamshell for missions that have an easterly or southeasterly trajectory. And what that does is it leaves the airway just to the north, AR6 and 15, open for during missions. That's a really critical part of the aviation system and a really critical airway. Some of the stats on the right-hand side, you can see we're talking about thousands of passengers that are not being impacted now for those missions. 84% of our missions since November 1st have been southeasterly or easterly trajectories that have allowed that airway to stay open, or those airways to stay open. That's really hitting home with our aviation partners, and as we focus on Florida, that's a key part of the equation there. And I believe that's this last slide. I will take questions on the guidelines or the questions on these slides.
All right, Gerald Mercer.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick question. You mentioned the space data integrator, the SDI. A year or so ago, a couple of years ago, I guess now, there were the data that provides the information for the SDI. You were working with industry, and it had to be voluntary. But back then, you were saying that you were going to try to get that to a point where it would be mandatory for commercial customers to provide data off of their rocket and its rocket performance near real time to allow you to get the information you need to be able to make more timely decisions and reduce that restricted area. Has that moved at all in that direction toward that discussion, or is it just all still voluntary for you?
Right, in general, it's voluntary. We're working with several operators. I think close to 8 to 10 operators on getting that data. We are approaching it as a collaborative effort. And I'll go back to our aviation partners that we have. We started CDM out there. In the 1990s, they had data that we thought would help us manage the system more effectively and more efficiently. And it was and it still remains a voluntary effort, but one that they see the benefit of in the ability to better manage the NAS. So right now we're taking that collaborative approach versus a regulatory or a mandatory approach. And it's working successfully. We've got many operators right now, most of the ones operating the system right now, actively engaged in onboarding to that SDI system. Next, Matt.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep, sure can.
Great. Well, first thing I wanted to say, Dwayne, was congratulations on all of the extremely productive work you and your team and the CSWG has done on these airspace issues. I think it's super positive and super positive for the industry as well. I guess the question I have is, we've got this space data integrator tool going back to General Mercer's question. At what point do you think, we're going to be in a position as an industry to distribute the information you're getting at the command center to controllers directly, so they can more efficiently develop, build, and shut down the hazard areas for the various launches?
Right now, we're looking at FY28 ability to do that. That's within our program management office, the NAS Space Integration Capabilities Program Office is led by Crystal Toney, and the PMO here at the FAA. Due to budgetary constraints, we're looking at a 28 capability right now, and that will get active hazard areas to the controller scopes plus decision support tools that they'll use to more effectively manage the airspace.
And as a quick follow-up, given that that's a pretty long timeline and it's a budgetary related item, how much more budget would you say you need to accelerate that to, let's say, 2024, 2025?
I'll defer to the PMO on that, Matt. I don't want to speculate on what it would cost or what the implications of that would be. I can certainly get you an answer for that, but yeah, it's what the acceleration exactly would look like. I'll get back to you on that and get back to the group.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Megan, did you have a question?
Matt got to the heart of my question, so thank you.
Okay. Come to Pete.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Dwayne. That was a great report. I'm really big on the whole integration process, so I'm encouraged by what I've heard, and I know the associate administrator also mentioned focus in that area. We've been dealing with that for a long time, right? With getting the information from SDI in a usable format for the air traffic controllers to be able to more dynamically manage the airspace, which would lessen the load quite a bit, as you know, during these launches, particularly over the waters area off the East Coast. It can cause quite a bit of a delay, and it's really unnecessary with the existing technology that we have today. Can you tell me, has there been an interest in space-based ADSB on the part of the FAA, or expanding the use of it, space-based ADSB, and also datacom communication efforts, so CNS oriented focus to more dynamically provide tools to the aviation sector also to be able to monitor and use the airspace more efficiently?
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. I know there's work within our next gen office to look at capabilities that would expand that in that direction. Right now within the ATO, that is not part of the program management, but it's part of the research and development on future capabilities that would be available.
Can I follow up one bit on that, if you wouldn't mind, with the group mind? One of the issues too, because I am on next gen and I'm also on AAAC. And one of the things I noticed is, we've got a limited amount of resources here, right? And deploying those and proceeding with a shared mental model, as we pilots like to call it, by integrating the information from the individual FAA committees like COMSTAC, like AAAC, and like NextGen. Has there any thought given to some kind of overarching communication effort? I know there's been individual efforts on the part of the ATO, which I think is great. I know you've stepped out, out of the box and really tried to create a more collaborative effort. But just in terms of resource and, building this kind of a shared mental model, have any thoughts to that?
I believe there's discussions right now about a follow-up to the the aviation rulemaking that was done in 2018 around airspace priorities or airspace access. So that I don't believe there's been any firm decisions on that, but I know there's been discussions around that. I think that probably gets to your point if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, it does, sir. And I was doing a speech at the International Aviation Club one day, and I covered this issue, and I got a lot of really positive feedback from it, particularly obviously here in the U.S. But I know our TCA has a template model for trying to integrate in, all the different committees that work at the different committees in a relevant way, right, in a useful way. But I appreciate your answer. Thank you very much, and thank you for your work.
Thank you.
All right, now Megan.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Dwayne. Appreciate the answer you gave Matt. I liked your slides. It looks like there's been a lot of progress. I heard you say that there are funding and resource constraints that are limiting when we can get the tools ready to go. We'd love to see the agency request more to support that. I think that's one of the things that from the commercial space operators perspective, we saw some of the cuts in the requested funds there. And happy to continue talking, obviously, whether COMSTAC or from an individual company perspective, we can work with the agency there. But I do want to ask about the airspace optimization guidance, because your slides indicate a lot of really great progress, and then that guidance seems to indicate that there's a step back. And in a sense, it read to me like, hey, we don't know what to do with you guys, so we're asking you to really take a step back, go to the back of the line, and we'll get to you after all the airlines. And I don't mean to be flippant here, but right, that's the very blunt read of it as a commercial space operator. So I'm just curious if you can kind of balance the two for me, right? Really great progress, but there's some constraints and the issues that air traffic sees related to commercial space causes difficulty there, right? Compared to weather and other movements, I know that there's a balance for you guys. So I'd love to hear it from you from an ATO perspective.
Yeah, Megan, I really read those as supporting what we're doing right now and really supporting our efforts and how we analyze and how we come to decisions. Some of the great things in there is the emphasis on collaboration. That's what I really appreciated, those comments in there in that guidance, because I think that's important to send the appropriate message that we are collaborating. This is a collaborative approach, not a one size and definitive from the ATO. It's more collaborated with industry. The other thing I liked on there is it's taking more of a finer pencil to it. In the past, we've used things like HARP, the Holiday Airspace Release Program, which was a rather blunt tool that some of the operators ran into issues. Like I described, many locations are not affected by the Holiday Airspace Release Program, but the impression was that you were limited by that. And there were also opportunities within that HARP that we could actually manage in a more efficient way. So what I liked about it is it took more of a finer pencil to it, and we got rid of the blunt approaches through these guidelines. And one of the things that I did not mention is really key to this is an unmet fulfillment from that airspace access priorities arc. One of the recommendations in there was the ability for industry to go and sandbox their missions. So you can determine upfront what constraints are out there, what possible constraints are out there, and you can make your business decisions based on that well in advance. What I'd like to see is a paradigm where you can sandbox those things, and we're not in the business of mitigating 2 weeks in advance or 3 weeks in advance, but you're really able to do your own mitigations well in advance, and then the collaboration will run out a little smoother than that. So really looking forward to that opportunity. We should be rolling something out very soon on that. We've got an effort with NASA to build in the collaborative environment a mission planning portal where you can go and sandbox those things on your own and work on your own. So that's being worked in that CDM group. We have a subgroup with industry partners on that with us, and we'll be developing that mission planning capability that I think is going to allow you to do exactly what's in those guidelines in advance. And it really won't come to a position of where we're saying we're not going to be able to accommodate a mission. You will have already been able to mitigate on your own. So
understood. I appreciate everything you're saying there, and I know you guys are trying very hard. I know we bring unique challenges to the airspace, but I do want to mention that sandboxing our missions based on constraints isn't equitable airspace, right? So I think there's more to be done on the collaborative decision making and how we all work together to really make it an equitable airspace. So more to come, I'm sure. So thank you.
absolutely.
All right, and with that, we have Michael Lopez Alegrea, and I want to get to Mike LA here. So I hate to cut off any of the discussion, but Mike has very limited time. He is not only chief astronaut at Axiom Space, he's also the chair of ASTM F-47 committee for the industry consensus standards. And just a quick other note, not only astronaut, test pilot, and commercial astronaut, but he does hold the second longest all-time EVA duration record, at least 10 spacewalks, and has spent at one point, and let me make sure that I get the right number, 215 days in space. So Mike, over to you if you would, please.
Thank you, Jim. You all hear me okay? Someone give me a thumbs up. Okay.
Yes, you're good.
Well, thanks. As Jim mentioned, I'm the chair of ASTM's F-47 Committee on Commercial Spaceflight. And we are, as I think most of you know, developing consensus standards, including industry, government, other stakeholders for the commercial spaceflight industry. So unless there's any questions preliminary, let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen and then share it.
We have your slides ready to go.
Oh, you do? Do you mind if I?
Oh, you can go ahead.
All right. Hopefully this is. How's that look?
You're good.
Okay. All right, so this is kind of our, I don't really know what legal and policy framework means, but this is, in my view, this is how we intersect with the work that AST is doing. And of course, what your folks as COMSTAC members are all about. And out of these two government documents, that NTTAA and OMB Circular A119, and I'll just summarize by saying, basically, they encourage the development of industry consensus standards to be used as a means of compliance by government regulators, and also encourages the participation in the development of those standards by that regulator. And of course, in our case, the regulator would normally be the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. And I'm happy to say that we do have quite a bit of participation from Jim and other members of AST. So a little history, way back when I was wearing Karina's hat as an other duty as a sign that I wasn't expecting, we started talking about we started talking about standards at the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. And I really didn't know very much about what that meant. We kind of looked around the room, and at the time, I would say the industry was a little bit more siloed than it is today. And so there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm to produce these standards on the part of companies. They were very concerned about other people seeing their secret sauce. There was also a little bit more, I'll say, cliquishness within the CSF and not wanting to share too much what was going on outside that organization. And so we decided to develop standards in-house. That was very slow. And I think because of the results, or I should say, because of the reasons that I stated before about people, wanting to kind of maintain their own company proprietary information, as well as a real dearth of bandwidth within these companies, it didn't really go very far. So a few years later, this was about 2012, 13. And a year or two later, we teamed up with a couple other more, I would say, well-known SDOs, AIAA and SAE. But for reasons that are no fault of theirs, but probably ours, I think our expectations were a little bit ambitious that they would basically be writing the standards. And of course, they didn't have the subject matter expertise. So those efforts kind of foundered a bit as well. And then in 2016, we decided to charge the hill one more time. We teamed up with ASTM, and we have been up and operating ever since. I'll tell you that it was a very slow start. A lot of the same concerns were back then, were still in place back then. But I'm confident and comfortable saying that I think that the committee has hit its stride, and it's starting to do work that I think we can all be proud of. So we've got 8 subcommittees. I would say 4 of them are kind of standing. So there's an executive subcommittee, there's one on terminology, there's one on road mapping, and there's what we call a liaison subcommittee. And then the other 5 are the more meaty kind of actually developing the standards. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. So as you see, we've got 7 standards. And if you do the math, that's about 1 a year. And as I understand it, that's about normal for ASTM committees. It's slower than I would like, but it is what it is. And again, I think we're starting to pick the pace up quite a bit. As a committee, we meet face-to-face twice a year. Usually we try to do it around other events. So for example, I think in a later slide, you'll see that we met just after the Space Symposium in Colorado last month. The executive subcommittee meets monthly, and the task groups meet as often as necessary, but anywhere from bi-weekly to monthly. And these are the people that are actually doing the standards. So every time there's a new standard that is adopted for development, a task group will be formed, and those guys do the work of actually putting it together. Oh, here's the committees. I didn't realize I had this on here, but on the right side of the slide, those are the committees that do the work. And the first 5 are the ones that are sort of the ones that actually house the task groups that put the standards together. There's a little bit of motherhood on this slide, but our goal is to promote safety within the industry. We want to share best practices. We try to coordinate with FAA, meaning it is important to us that our standards be, obviously they're industry consensus standards, and we assume that the industry that is participating in the development of those standards will follow them. It is completely voluntary, so you don't have to follow the standards, but we think that a high level of participation is indicative. And I can tell you that this is a very an important topic of interest with the congressional committee. So I testified. I met with the staff of the House Science Committee and the Senate Commerce Committee, both sides, both. What am I thinking? Majority and minority were both present. And the question that was very common was, how can we tell whether these things are being followed? Because we have no compliance method or any way to ensure that. But again, we think that if the companies are participating in the standards, then they're going to comply. And then ultimately, when the moratorium, the learning period sunsets, whenever that is, we'd like to have standards in place that since the AST was also in the room when we developed them, will be considered as a means of compliance so that we can have a standard that we think the industry is comfortable with, but that's also acceptable to the regulator. So here's our members. Hopefully you recognize most of these. We have operators, and I want to emphasize there has been a bit of a, I would say, a fear or a concern that this is a little bit of a CSF mouthpiece. I can tell you it is absolutely not. We have a lot of participation from legacy space companies, both on the executive committee as well as the actual participation of the task group. So I think it's very important. We also have members from ALPA that are on the team, spaceport operators. The medical thing we'll talk about a little bit in a second, but there are a lot of really expert subject matter experts in aerospace medicine that are helping develop first a suborbital medical qualification standard and then later an orbital one. And this is kind of where we've been and where we're going. As I mentioned, phase one was a little bit rocky. You know, we were trying to get the thing off the ground. We had to convince the industry teams that there was a good rationale to do this, despite the fact that they were going to have to talk to each other a little bit more openly that maybe they were comfortable with in the beginning. I think that's where it's worked out well. This business about the ASTM way, there's a very specific set of guidelines that have to be followed when you're developing a standards, and those guidelines have to do with who participates in the voting. So they're controlled populations from users, from developers, and from general public, and those votes have to be apportioned appropriately so that you don't have, the vehicle developers, for example, passing their standards and not letting the general public or users be involved. And so these things are all what go into that OMB circular that I mentioned that dictates what those requirements are. And if those requirements are met, then we can use them as a means of compliance for a regulator. But this is all part of the so-called ASTM way. I would say that early on, we were doing standards that were considered low-hanging fruit, so that people within the industry kind of agreed that A, we can live with something on this topic, and B, it's relatively easy to develop because there wasn't a lot of contention. And now we've gotten into some more grisly ones. I'll talk a little bit more about one on crew safety, which I think is kind of a nice poster child for that work that we've done. So I think we're in phase two now, where we are really, again, trying to tackle standards that have more applicability to what a regulator might be interested in doing. We have buy-in from a lot of, I shouldn't say buy-in, participation from a lot of the industry, I should say from the government entities that you see listed in that second bullet. We took a good look at the recommended practices for human spaceflight that FAA came out with. We've used NASA's 1130 document quite a bit in the crew safety standard. So we are definitely taking a lot of input from what we think would be appropriate documentation for an eventual regulatory regime. And then the future is just, we want to keep growing. I mean, we really, we're expanding a little bit into other areas. In the beginning, we were focused on, suborbital and orbital and spaceports, I would say, in gross as kind of the areas. Now we're getting a little bit into satellite servicing, EVA, suit design. So there are some things we're branching out quite a bit. And I think, again, this is all led by the SMEs from the industry with participation from government. Here's the stuff that we've published already. The second one, the terminology keeps getting updated every few months or so. When we add new terms, I would point to a couple of these, the classifying safety-related events. This is kind of a baby step toward a reporting system similar to what the FAA on the aviation side and NASA both use in terms of something not quite right happens, far short of a mishap, but something, an anomaly, let's call it. and we'd like to have some kind of a system where you could report that so that other industry users can be made aware of what that is and apply, see if any of those conditions or circumstances under which those happened apply to their operation, and if so, obviously make adjustments accordingly. We're not there yet, but the first step was to classify the safety-related events. And we can talk about any more of these if you'd like to. I'm not the expert, I'll tell you that. And please forgive the image on the left. I don't make these slides, I just present them. I know maybe some of you are fans of all that. That's all good. The two that are in ballot right now are a classification for launch and reentry vehicles and the standard guide for medical qualifications. So this was one that I think we went around quite a bit with various companies having a say in basically putting their spin on things. And it's just sort of a very nice example of how this process is supposed to work with the companies and other stakeholders being involved in what ends up being just a negotiation to get to, okay. I wanted to talk about the practice for crew safety. So this is a pretty aggressive standard that draws a lot, as I said, from NASA's 1130. We've had a lot of back and forth on things that try to accommodate I would say, the philosophies of the different companies. Sort of think of it as a measure of the degree of reliance on automation as opposed to manual aspects. So again, this is a nice example of how it's supposed to work. I think I mentioned the meetings. Here's some of the stuff that's going on now on the bottom, just on the calendar, so to speak. So you see stuff is going on every week. There are several meetings of the task groups and or the executive subcommittee. Oh my gosh. So I actually chaired an executive subcommittee meeting from space. This is last April. Apologies for that. And I think that's it. So I'm happy to take questions. There you see the leadership. We're having elections this year to start next year. My term is timing out at the end of this year. So we'll have a new leadership team, but I think we will hopefully continue to maintain a strong group that can continue to lead this thing into a bigger and bigger membership and volume of work. What can I answer?
All right, any questions? Great, thank you, Mike LA. I appreciate it. Boy, you get off easy today.
Yeah, I can't even figure out how to stop sharing, but I'll just get off the screen. That'll work.
All right.
It's good
Thank
to
you,
see
sir.
everybody. Thanks, Jim.
All right. Appreciate it. Next, PM Underwood from the Office of Spaceports. She's the director. She is going to be presenting and talking about the interagency working group. Pam, are you available?
I am here. Can everyone hear me
Perfect.
and see me? Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hello, thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share screen. If I can figure it out, put my glasses
Or we
on.
have your slides. John Vendetti should be putting them up here momentarily.
Oh,
Make it
even
easy.
better. Then I don't need to
Yes.
worry about trying to be responsible for that. That's great.
Right. There they are. They are up.
Thank you. So appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone this morning about what's going on with the interagency working group. Let's go ahead and dive in, please. You probably remember that this was announced formation at our conference in 2022. Between that time and June, we conducted 2 planning meetings and we officially kicked things off in June with the signing of the charter. Next chart, please. These are the member agencies that nothing has changed since the original announcement. We've had great support from everybody, just in case for those of you that didn't know, but these are the folks that are participating in it, really all the stakeholders. And then of course, we've had industry feedback as well, which I'll talk about in another slide or two. Next chart, please. So in the charter, for any of you who have not had a chance to look at it, it is on our website. These are some of the goals that we have. We do want to maintain a leadership role in commercial space transportation. The United States has the most and best spaceport infrastructure of any country. We want to continue that. So how can we leverage the full capability of what we have? Through that, we want to develop a strategy to have resiliency and an interoperable network of spaceports to meet everyone's national objectives. We want to collaborate on policies and standards for spaceport utilization, and of course, advocate for any resources and programs that might be needed to enhance and achieve those goals that just mentioned. So really pretty straightforward goals in the charter. Next chart, please. Some of our initial objectives, digging down a little bit deeper, we want to establish an action plan that will help define and really become the skeleton of a spaceport strategy that'll have policy and be commensurate with U.S. strategic objectives, customers and users alike. We want to develop a plan for infrastructure grant programs and maybe some alternative investment opportunities for spaceports. Spaceport infrastructure is not unique, just like all other infrastructure, it does require investment. And if we want to really keep innovating and keep up with the industry, we have to have a plan for how we're going to do that. That's really what that second objective speaks to. This is really important to establish that full network. We want to establish and advocate for common terminology and standards. That's really how we're going to get interoperability in the future. Now, we recognize that every spaceport grew up a little bit different, and sometimes the differences that we see are a result of user or customer specific needs, but there are some top level standardization that we would like to see happen so that you can help to develop that interoperability and really more importantly, that resilience that I just spoke about in the previous chart. Next chart, please. So in order to do this, we really want to analyze the relationship between federal spaceports and FAA licensed or private spaceports, and how can we work together to have those work better, and what are the policies that might need to be in place to hopefully allow better utilization of both. And of course, we want to have identification of investment methods, which is similar to what I talked about before with the grant programs, so that we can encourage technology development. Our spaceports need to innovate just like our launch vehicles are into the future. And how can we encourage those types of activities moving forward? And we can't lose sight of number 6. This is really important. Are we doing things most efficiently? Are we having the best economic approach to help decrease launch costs, but increase effectiveness all at the same time? So that's really kind of diving down deeper a little bit of what our initial objectives were when we started out. Some of the details that you may not just get from looking at the charter of goals that I just mentioned. Next chart, please. So this is this group of challenges that we have here, these 5 things, these 5 main bullets on this chart. This is what the team identified as current challenges that we wanted this action plan, this strategy to go at and address. In some of our spaceports, we have aging and inadequate infrastructure. Just hasn't been the focus on infrastructure investment or innovation in the past. So it's led us to this aged and inadequate infrastructure. Some of our spaceports are experiencing significant congestion, scheduling conflicts and prioritization, even with airspace and maritime users, sometimes is quite challenging, really only compounds the congestion problems at some of our spaceports. Capacity, if you look at the nation's demand right now, there is a lack of vertical launch sites and engine test sites. Last year, in the last several years, vertical launch represent approximately 92% of the total FAA licensed activity. And if you look at the number of spaceports that we have, the vast majority of them don't support vertical. So how can we take a look at those capacity issues when looking at this strategy and where we'd like to go with the infrastructure? There's also some challenges with some government policy and potentially lack of funding for infrastructure investments. Maybe even some improper legislative authorities involved. So we've got to take a look at those things. You know, speaking specifically to the excess capacity model, I think all of you are familiar with it, Title 51. directs the Secretary of Transportation to encourage the use of excess capacity at the federal ranges. But has that model kind of outlived itself when we have federal ranges that are vastly dominated by commercial launch, which is good. That's very successful. That's a very productive thing. But are some of those models that in those policies really outdated? And clearly, we should also look at redundancy in government approvals and duplication efforts as well. The last bullet speaks to international leadership. We definitely, as I started with, we have the best and most infrastructure of any country without question, but is there really a good method for sharing that expertise, sharing that knowledge so that we can be that global leader? As other spaceports are developed in other countries, we would like them to follow the same types of models for safety that we do. So regardless where the launch occurs, there's the same level of safety. And the United States is in a very unique spot to be able to share our experience. And we just want to make sure that the right forums and conversations are going on to really enable that leadership. So those are the challenges that we've identified. Next chart, please. So I did mention at the top that we are an interagency government working group, but we have had engagements with industry. In September of last year, we did have a 3-day focused industry summit where we invited spaceport directors because, again, we're trying to leverage that federal range, non-federal range relationship and dynamic to make sure we're getting the full capability of our nation's network of spaceports. And we also had launch service providers that are operating from those spaceports, whether at federal ranges or the FAA licensed sites. And we wanted to get feedback on the challenges and the goals and objectives of the group. We did meet with our 10 spaceports and 9 different launch operators. We got some great feedback to help us refine kind of our challenges and our focus areas. From that, we've taken and started to write draft recommendations. We hope to, in June, have a follow-up with industry to get back with the same folks that we met with in September and, iterate again on the next level of product, looking at some of our recommendations. But we really feel like industry involvement is very important to make sure that this interagency working group can go in the right direction and satisfy industry needs going forward. Next chart, please. I think that might have been my last one. It is. So really, that's kind of a summation where we're at. Our next engagement is planned for June of this year to bring the industry in. We'll be looking at our next level down detail of information, which is some draft recommendations. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there are from the group.
George Neal.
Yes, hello, Pam.
Hi, George.
Wonder if you could give us a status on the outlook for spaceport infrastructure grants, either the STEM program or some alternatives that have been discussed in the past.
Well, when a couple of years ago, I started an effort looking at our grant program. Of course, everyone knows the authority's been out there for some time, and we have implemented it in the 2010, 2011, 2012 timeframe. But what I wanted to look at is how is our grant program looking compared to other DOT programs? We're not the only ones in the DOT that have the authority to issue grants. So I did a benchmarking effort to talk with highways, railroads, MARAD, and try to find out what worked and what didn't work for theirs. And through that, we've got a lot of lessons learned that I think when we do have the opportunity to implement the grant program again, we're going to come at it from a different perspective. And I think that'll be really helpful. As far as, when that might occur, George, it really depends on when we could see funding available for that. And I'm not sure that I know a status on that at this point.
So just to follow up, I think that's certainly of interest to the COMSTAC and Spaceport members in particular. And so if the FAA is not able to press forward with its current budgets or authorities, that would be something that I think is worth pursuing at DOT and with the Congress and the White House.
Thanks, George.
All right, thank you, Joe Mercer.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for that that update, Pam Underwood. I just want to take a minute to applaud the effort, Pam Underwood, that what you and your team has taken on in terms of bringing on and engaging with the non-federal spaceports in the working group. You know, as more and more the non-federal spaceports are engaging more and more in national security capability and new and innovative models to which operate spaceports. So I just wanted to thank you for embracing the non-federal spaceports. I know that that was kind of a stretch in your thinking to get out there and embrace us, but I absolutely believe, based on the results of your engagement with that, that it was the right thing to do. And so I wanted to thank you for that. I know that it was you know, a bit challenging for you and your team to pull that off and get everybody on board. But I applaud you for that effort and thank you for that.
Thanks, Ted. I appreciate that. And you know, honestly, the support from the industry, the feedback we've gotten from you, Ted, specifically, and other spaceport directors in industry is really vital. So we're coming up again in June. You know, we're letting people know again. So that's really helpful. And that's a great way for all of us to keep moving in the same direction.
All right. Thank you. And to keep us somewhat off schedule, we'll go ahead and move to RAND Corporation. Ben Miller is an economist there and is also one of the primary people who wrote the RAND report. This was the report that was the independent assessment that Congress directed. And so he's here to brief out the results of that report. So Ben, without further delay, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim. I hope you all can hear me okay. The talk of congestion is hitting a little close to home today, but hopefully I'm coming through all right. I think John's put up the set of slides. Otherwise, I can pull them up on my end, whatever folks prefer. But as Jim gave the intro, basically give a talk through the report, and we'll go ahead and launch into the slide deck here. Perfect. So, as Jim mentioned, this comes out of the 2015 Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. Right there, as you all know, there's a whole bunch of different studies called for in that, most of them conducted by the FAA. This particular one conducted by RAND to be separate and independent. There's three sort of broad categories of things we were asked to look at in this study, and in the presentation here, I'll just sort of walk through these one at a time with a little summary up front. But those three things, as you know, they were looking at the progress of the commercial space industry in adopting these voluntary industry consensus standards. We've talked a lot about the progress. Mike just did a great update there. We talked about the progress of the commercial space industry towards meeting key industry metrics, those metrics that came up in some of the past reports that FAA put out. And then the sort of broad assessment of whether areas that have been previously identified were appropriate for regulatory action or further development of the industry consensus standards. We take that to mean sort of a broad assessment of the readiness of the industry for transition to a safety framework that may include regulations. So with that, we'll go ahead and proceed to the next slide, which is essentially just a summary of the key takeaways. I try not to give mystery novels as presentations. So these are the core findings of our report. The key finding up front that I know not everybody agrees with, but this is the finding of our report, is essentially we suggest allowing the moratorium to end on October 1 as per current law. There's a bunch of reasons for this that we can talk through, and I'm happy to discuss any questions about it. Essentially, this will allow informal rulemaking activities to proceed concurrently with the development of voluntary consensus standards. So this isn't replacing all the great work that's going on in F-47 and other SDOs. We just got a presentation earlier about some of the progress that's occurring at the SDOs, which is fantastic progress. That said, as we talked to a lot of folks along the way in this report, there's definitely a lot of concern that the standards development process is slow and that adoption of those standards is difficult to verify, as Mike mentioned. Finally, we talk about safety practices. There are safety practices that exist. The industry has a great appreciation for for the importance of safety. The details of those practices are proprietary, so it's difficult to impossible for any external party to assess the extent to which those practices are meeting the standards, and the current metrics that exist, excuse me, for assessing the readiness are, as we'll talk about in the slides here, kind of difficult to use and apply. Finally, we want to emphasize this discussion around the moratorium, sort of extended or not extended. We don't view it as quite so binary of a decision. I'll talk about the different ways in which that could play out in Congress in the slides here. But essentially, there may be some parts of operations that are ready for regulation for others. And we really want to emphasize that the moratorium can end without regulations being immediately implemented, right? It's not that the end of the moratorium on October 1 means a whole set of regulatory framework immediately falls out of the sky. So those are the key takeaways. I'm going to proceed through a little more detail here, and we can talk about them at the end here. So next slide. All right. So on that first point, findings about the development of voluntary consensus standards. Mike gave a great presentation about this earlier, so I won't dwell on this too much. There's a lot of great work going on, 7 different standards out already, and a whole bunch more in the pipeline. There are challenges with voluntary standards development. There's always challenges with voluntary standards development. So some of these are just sort of facts of how it works, right? Consensus can be a difficult thing to reach. Information and data sharing is a challenge. Mike talked about how that's been evolving over time, and I was really pleased to hear to talk about the new standard on that Mike mentioned. And as we mentioned, a lot of folks are concerned that the process is slow, right? There's little tension there of is it slower than these things typically are? That's hard to say, but regardless on that front, there's definitely a lot of concern that the process is slow. Finally, one of the points is that we didn't see any evidence that an extension of the moratorium would in any way change the speed of the creation of these consensus standards. We see a lot of initiative moving forward on those now. We're really happy to see that. All set for next slide. A few other points on development of voluntary consensus standard. As the name suggests, they are voluntary, right? Industry can adopt these or not as they see fit. And because the details of the safety practices the industry are adopting are generally treated as proprietary, we're not able to assess one way or another whether industry's practices are or are not meeting these standards. So we have no comment on that. We know that folks have processes in place, right? We know that folks, there's an informed consent regime, people have to sign waivers, there's various trainings that participants are going through. We know these vary a bit across industries, so different companies may be doing things different ways. And in that sense, there's not a single set of standards that are adopted in the sense that everybody's literally doing the same thing. It may not be appropriate for everybody to do literally the same thing if all the designs of ships are different in these things. But there is a verification challenge there, and that maybe gets at some of the difference between a set of voluntary standards and a safety framework that may include more regulation. As I said, despite some of these shortcomings or features, depending on how you view it, stakeholders definitely finding the process valuable. Across the board we talked to, everybody seemed, or at least the vast majority of people we talked to, were really pleased with the consensus standards development process, and there's a broad understanding that this is something that should continue as a valuable activity. Go ahead to the next slide. The next slide we talk about that second bullet we were asked to cover, the metrics and the assessment thus far. So in the past reports there's been a whole bunch of different metrics and indicators about the progress of the industry and readiness for standards and these sorts of things. I think this matches some of the comments that others have said elsewhere, but we had some challenges with these metrics. It wasn't clear to us exactly how they would be used and what they even would necessarily indicate. So for example, if you have a standard that says the number of individuals who travel to space per year, what does that mean in terms of readiness for transition to regulatory framework? Is it once there's 7, 50, 1,000? Like what's the right number? It's not clear how to go from that sort of metric to sort of an objective decision about, oh, now the industry is ready. And so that's one of the big challenges with some of these metrics. We talked about the industry progress towards meeting these metrics. There's been presentations earlier today about the growth in the number launches, and that this thing has been tracking up, especially this last year. In this current year, we've seen a lot more launches, and so we see a lot of growth in the industry. We've talked about how the purpose of the moratorium initially was to sort of give the space for the development of standards. And in part, one of the arguments that got made repeatedly is because the growth was slower than anticipated at the original point in time in the moratorium, that was an argument for extending it further, so that was sort of more time was needed. Another argument is that essentially it's self-policing, it's effective, that there's few safety incidents to date. That doesn't mean there have been no safety incidents, but in general, the moratorium, as you know, has a catch in it that I think was mentioned earlier, that if there is a safety incident, it can be paid. That has not occurred. And so that's where we're at to date. So on to the next slide here, we'll talk about the third finding, which is the readiness of the industry for regulation. We looked at this in a set of basically 5 factors. We took a framework for assessing readiness in other sectors and applied it in this one as well. And essentially we looked across the board at 5 different categories, and we'll talk through each of them and kind of assess the readiness, not just of industry. This is readiness of the whole group collectively, right? Readiness of industry, readiness of the FAA, readiness of all stakeholders involved. Right. So the first of these sort of 5 bullets is the access to and understanding of the regulatory process. And this one's particularly on the industry side, how ready or how familiar are folks with the regulatory process. Obviously, the moratorium carves out just as a very specific part in terms of passenger safety. There's already regulations around launch and re-entry. The large organizations have a fairly good understanding of the SPARK process, the informal rulemaking process, APMs, all of these things. And so we're not deeply concerned about a lack of understanding of how the regulatory process works causing a holdup. That said, we do want to put a major asterisk on that to emphasize that especially the smaller startup firms may have a lot more limitations here than the bigger firms, right? That there's, regardless of what the level of understanding is at, just the resourcing capacity for these smaller startup firms may be a real challenge to engage in some of these things. The second aspect of readiness is about the certainty of future regulations. One of the big themes that emerged as we talked to folks across the community was this view that a safety framework is in some sense inevitable, right? That we're collectively going to transition to a safety framework at some point. It's a question of when, not if. And there was some tension here. There's a need to transition to it, particularly prior to some sort of catastrophic event. There's a view that just in sort of a sheer law of large numbers, something will eventually go wrong and someone will get hurt. And there was a view that it's very important to have a safety framework in place before that happened. That said, I don't think everyone we talk to is necessarily rushing to have a safety framework right away. The challenge is it takes time to develop these things, as you all know. And so it's sort of when do you start that process and get that ball rolling such that it's done before this sort of uncertain event happens. And that's kind of a tricky needle to thread. And the reason for having that safety framework in place, as noted on the slides, is there was a fear that if something goes wrong, if there's some sort of catastrophic event, that there could be a sort of visceral reaction from Congress to create some legislation that requires more immediate regulation. And there was a strong view that that sort of reaction would likely result in a suboptimal regulatory regime, that the regulation that would result from this sort of we want regulations and we want them now attitude would be worse than a regulatory process that folks were able to develop through a more thoughtful and reflective process that takes a lot more time. Onto the next slide. The last 3 of these 5 factors. First of all, looking at the effectiveness of regulatory support. There's a lot of processes in place here. We've talked about SPARKs. There were presentation comments earlier today about all sorts of new SPARKs. There are formal rulemaking processes that are being put in place. So there are sort of regulatory mechanisms to manage all these things. So there's not a need to create sort of a new process to conduct regulations. That said, another sort of nearly universal set of comments that we received from folks was about resourcing, right? That the concern that FAA just simply doesn't have the resources to devote to these things at present. And that if the FAA is going to be taking on this sort of additional regulatory authority, then they're really going to need the resources to go along with that in order to keep up with things. It's sort of hard enough to keep up with launch and entry already. Finally, on the cost side, this is a concern about, there's a broad concern among folks we talked to that regulations might somehow cause harm to the industry, right? FAA, even in their regulatory authority, has requirement to help promote the industry. And that was generally one of the major concerns about the reason to extend the moratorium, is this concern that if regulations were implemented, it would somehow stifle the growth or creativity of the industry. When we tried to dive in deeper to that, we had a lot of trouble finding much support for that concern. Certainly, if we're talking about very prescriptive standards that were sort of overly constraining and how the industry develops, that could be a concern. But those didn't seem to be the types of standards or regulations that were being under discussion. Right, there's much more sort of a performance-based approaches that we didn't think would have the same stifling concerns, nor do we see much appetite. FAA themselves doesn't seem to have an incentive to stifle the industry either. It seems like no one involved sort of wants the industry as a whole to be stifled. And so we're not deeply concerned about that front, although I know there are some folks on the call here who I'm sure will disagree with that. Finally, on the ability to pass regulations, again, there is a process in place. The Sparks informal rulemaking processes that we're familiar with. Again, we just wanted to highlight the staffing and budget limitations, just in terms of FAA potentially being spread too thin. These weren't questions that were raised about FAA's capabilities, but just rather should they be sufficiently resourced, but rather just whether they're spread too thin at the moment without sufficient budget and staffing to do that. So I think that takes us to the next slide, which is, I believe, where I just wanted to zoom back into the comment I made earlier about this not being a binary decision. Right, so we talk about extending the moratorium or not extending the moratorium. In that sense, it's binary. But we want to highlight there's a lot of different paths within each of these things. And we've had this same conversation with folks on the Hill. These sort of four options on the bottom are what we see as sort of the four potential approaches Congress can take. Right, and these four options are presented without any our preferences in the third one, and I'll get to that, but we're sort of laying out, here's the suite of options that we see as under potential serious discussion, and you can find op-eds and things written in favor of one or the other. Under the moratorium, there's a couple different options. One is a complete extension, right? Just for Congress to pass a law that says the moratorium, instead of expiring October 1st, will now expire at some later point in time, right? However, there is a slight alternative to that was raised. You can imagine, and this is called sort of a glide path option, where the moratorium is extended, but Congress carves out particular exemptions and says, we're extending the moratorium except that FAA can look at these particular aspects of commercial participant safety, and that Congress would specify particular areas that they felt were ready. On the side of allowing the moratorium to end, and the third option, which is the one we're recommending, essentially doesn't require any action by Congress at all, at least in the near term, other than resourcing FAA appropriately. If nothing is written, if nothing has changed, the moratorium ends on October 1st, and we enter the sort of open-ended regulatory learning period. There's no law in place that says regulations have to be implemented by any particular point in time. Congress isn't directing particular topic areas to be focused on. It's just sort of now the ball's in the FAA's court for next steps. And we would advise thinking about new sparks and informal rulemaking processes. It takes time to make these regulations. There, as we said, there's not a set of regulations ready to fall out of the sky and land on people October 1st. There is a more extreme version of that. Rather than just allowing the moratorium to end, Congress could write into law something that says the moratorium is going to end and we want regulations and we want them by this date. Let's say a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. It could be anything. That's certainly something Congress to do as well. We don't recommend that approach. It takes time, as you all know. This has been a discussion many years in the making. That's going to continue to be a discussion for many years. And we don't think that the creation of those sorts of artificial deadlines, that it could create the risk that folks are trying to avoid, of creating the need to impose regulations before they've been sort of fully thought through and fleshed out. So I think that takes us to the final slide here, which is just the list of recommendations. And in some ways, this is reiterating the points I raised at the beginning. couple recommendations for all sorts of different parties. So 2 for the FAA. Our recommendation is to allow the moratorium to end and to resource the FAA appropriately to go through these rulemaking processes and think about what these regulations would look like. For the FAA, convenient spark for persistent safety. Consider limited informal rulemaking. All of this done in communication with industry, such as, just like these conversations we're having now. We talked a lot in the report about the importance of data sharing, so I was really glad to hear Mike's comments on that earlier. And finally, just for the stakeholder community as a whole, just continuing to develop the voluntary industry consensus standards, these key metrics. There's a lot of support for what's being done in these groups, and it's really helpful for the development process overall. So I know we're running a little behind, so I think I'm going to end there. Happy to answer any questions from folks, and thanks for this opportunity to talk with you all.
All right, any questions? Mike?
Yeah, Ben, thank you. I know Rand spent a lot of time working on this. I think just maybe it's more of a statement, but I would appreciate your comments and insights to it. Is, we talk a lot about the pace of development, and we list here the symptoms, right? The slow to and difficult to develop new standards, hard to get consensus, and we talk about that there's reasons given that are kind of maybe more, at least in my opinion, kind of smoke screens of privacy concerns or proprietary data concerns, but we don't really talk about why are we seeing slow and difficult to get to there. And I would postulate, right, that it despite lots of advancement in the uncrewed launch systems, right, we've really only seen human spaceflight systems operating regularly in the last 2 years. There's only currently 3 companies doing it, and that the variety of systems is broad, right? You've got a suborbital capsule, a suborbital space plane, and an orbital capsule. Half those launches at the orbital side are actually meeting NASA contractual requirements. So the need to spend time working on a standard when you've already have a contractual agreement is different. The report doesn't really tackle that, right? And this kind of is a foreshadowing to the afternoon conversations about where we're going. But I feel like it's easy to talk about, but it's also a little bit doing a disservice to the complexity of writing a standard that applies to 3 people doing 18 launches in 2 years, right? That's not maturity for standards or for regulations either. So I just was curious, as you went through your interviews and your investigations, where you found challenges on that front, right? From the ability to actually get to consensus when the systems themselves don't allow you to get to consensus.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the interesting things we found in the course of our work is that the existence of a moratorium in this space is actually somewhat unusual, right? If you look at other newly developing industries, there aren't typically moratoriums in place. So this concept of a moratorium in and of itself is entirely new. And in those past examples, it's usually not the case that there's a whole bunch of regulations coming out of the gate, holding back new industries from the get-go. It's a sort of development process that goes sort of hand in hand with the development of the industry. So I don't think it's the case that, because there's only 3 launch providers now, that means it's sort of too soon in any way to start having these discussions, especially when we're talking about discussions that are going to take years. And as long as we're keeping all parties involved, everybody in this room is going to have the chance to say their piece. We can make sure that the standards that are being developed, any regulations or informal rulemaking is going to be developed, is done in a way that's not just talking about the way things exist now, but is also about setting up a set of ground rules that everybody can operate, because that gives everybody sort of a stable business environment and to know what you're all working against, right? It removes a lot of uncertainty, and there's sort of the risk treatment of it as well that we can get into.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I think it is a classic chicken and the egg, right? You need a roadmap to know where you're going, but it's hard to get on the bus when you don't know where it's headed, right?
All right, Captain DePete.
The mute button there. Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. Hey, great report. And, I'm just going to hop alongside Mike here and say, one of the things, having a lot of experience in the aviation realm, right, which is had an enormous amount of time to develop over time, right, and to try to take, where this nascent industry is right at the moment, although it has been around, but capabilities have vastly grown, which is a good thing. You know, I've always had a philosophy that you build the sidewalk where you see the footpath, right? And that footpath has not really truly in the area of human spaceflight. You know, it's not very definable at the moment, right? So it's still, I know we put some guardrails up with the moratorium and tried to, you know, based on what we saw with the growth, give an expectation. I will say this, you know, seeing everything through the lens of safety, I'm very impressed with this committee's work. And I'll even mention that I think the FAA's report, you know, back in 2014 with the set up a really nice template, right, for human spaceflight. And, you know, it's probably something we could build with. But I just think it's been a little difficult for us to define because of the scope of it, right, and the varied operations. But I mean, we're getting there. But I think, you know, your report is great. It's been really helpful to us. But I think we're going to need a little bit of help along the lines of defining where the scope is really at the moment, because the vehicles and the operations are so varied at this point. So and there hasn't been a lot of experience in this area. So thanks.
Yeah, really, really good comments. And we completely agree that there's still a lot of development. This is still a very nascent industry. There's a lot of change going on. I think the big distinction that I want to raise here is the distinction between regulation and authority to regulate, because I feel like those two are getting muddled a lot. The moratorium ending does not mean FAA, does not mean regulations are implemented. It means FAA has the authority to begin even considering regulations. Right? They can't even think about it really right now without running afoul of the moratorium. The thinking process, as you know, involves a lot of time, and this is something that we believe has to happen concurrently. And there's processes in place, right? If there was a situation where regulations were getting ahead of the development of the industry and stifling industry growth, there's processes in place where these can be contested, right? There are ways to contest regulations that are viewed as potentially damaging. There are ways to contest regulations that violate FAA's responsibility for promoting the growth of the industry, which is currently in law, right? FAA is responsible for helping promote this industry. So we think it's a bit of a separation needs to be made between an individual regulation being too much for an industry that's still so new, and just the authority to begin thinking about what regulations might look like for the future, sort of setting the baseline for it to work with. We view those as two different things. And I absolutely agreed that a sort of a very prescriptive limiting regulation coming down that really stifles industry is not a good idea right now and should indeed be challenged, and almost certainly would be challenged. Because it would be challenged, we just don't think it's very likely to happen. Rather, what we do think is important is for there to be sparks, for there to be advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, for there to be conversations about data sharing. And it creates a little more impetus behind what's going on in ASTM and these other groups as well.
All right, thank you. Mike French.
Thanks, and maybe I'll just make this more of a comment since so we can get to other people's questions here. And I guess maybe this is more directed, maybe Jim and Calvin over to the FAA AST team. My read of the RAND report is that it answers one of the three things required by Congress for an independent report. It does not. It punts on analyzing key metrics for readiness, and it does not get into the specific areas you all identified in your 2022 report of standards and assesses where they're ready. And just wondering from AST's perspective, whether you'll consider this report having be done as far as the congressional requirements, or if there'll be another independent report to answer those other two things that RAND didn't address. Thanks.
So we're going to go, Jim?
Nope, I believe Ben was going to make a comment, but Kelvin, why don't you go first?
Well, let me let Ben answer. Go ahead, Ben.
All right.
Sure. So I just want to quickly say that we did answer those questions to the extent that there's data availability. Right? Some of these things, as we say in the report, it's difficult to assess the metrics when some of the availability of the information just simply isn't provided. In some cases, industry isn't comfortable sharing that information. Right? So you can't have a public-facing report that includes non-public information. We're more than happy to use that information. We need asked for that information, but it's often viewed as proprietary, not providable. Happy to get into more of the details about what you felt was and was not answered. I'm more than happy to provide more information on the report if helpful. So feel free to reach out if there's questions on that. But I'll leave it to the FAA to answer their questions about sort of what actions they'll take.
So we don't have any plan, Mike, to request another independent report. The report that RAND submitted, we set it up in accordance with the congressional language. That's how we scoped it. We laid it out just that way. So we'll leave it to our congressional colleagues to make their assessments of what's there and what's not there. If they want another bite at the apple, another report, then we'll leave it to Congress to ask for that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Colin.
All right, thanks. Megan.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Thanks, Ben, for those comments. First, I want to say, Mike Moses, I agree with everything you said and appreciate the remarks you made. Ben, you said something that was a little concerning to me and I think needs to be clarified. You said that during the learning period that AST is not allowed to consider regulations, not even think about that. That's not true. So it's actually written into Title 51, 50901, 50905 C4, and it says nothing in the subsection shall be construed to limit the authority of the secretary to discuss potential regulatory approaches, potential performance standards, or any other topic related to this subsection within the commercial space industry. I know that you have to know that, having written the report. I know AST knows that. And the fact that they stood up a Part 460 Spark while we are in the learning period proves that point. So I want to make it very clear that like this fallacy keeps being promoted, and it troubles me to hear you say it and see a team of folks here that like might believe it. So I have to make that clear. That's all.
Sure. Much appreciated on that comment. There are still limitations that really do prohibit how far FAA can go with these things. So the Spark is, as you know, is fairly recently stood up. There are still limitations on how far FAA can go, right? They can't do in advance no proposed rulemaking or no proposed rulemaking because this would be initiations of a regulatory process, and that's not allowed, right? And there's also sort of an indirect constraint here in that if FAA was going to do a further investigation of these things, devote the staff and time to consider these things, they'd have to ask for additional resources, as pretty much everyone that we spoke with agreed that they don't have the staffing to do this. However, it's really challenging for FAA to go to Congress and say, we need more funds to investigate a topic that we're, potential regulations that we're not allowed to issue yet. Again, it's sort of a chicken egg problem per Mike's point before.
But I want to point out they did get 40 people to focus on human spaceflight. Right, I believe that was in last year's, and they were given funding to support hiring people to do human spaceflight regulations, which industry supported. So I just want to be clear, like there is a bit of work that industry is trying to support with FAA to make these considerations and have these discussions. It is a dialogue. I agree with you on there's certain limitations, but I feel like there's things there are nuances here that need to be pointed out and shouldn't be left.
No, totally agree that conversation is occurring between FAA and industry. It's absolutely occurring. It's important that it's occurring and continue to occur. We just think it's okay for there to be additional veils of formality about it.
All right, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I first of all want to also associate myself with Mike's comments and Megan's as well. I think one of the things that struck me about the RAND report was that it comes to two inconsistent conclusions. One is that the learning period should expire, and the other is that the FAA currently doesn't have the resources to implement a coherent or robust regulatory approach. So I think it should, I think everyone on this call ought to take a deep dive into that report, because there are a lot of instances like this that on their face, the conclusions, just don't seem to make a lot of sense. If the FAA is not currently prepared as concluded by RAND to move ahead with these regulations, then that would, it seemed to me, be an argument for continuing the learning period until both the FAA and the industry are prepared to move forward in a coherent and robust way that doesn't do harm to the industry.
Thanks, Matt. I am going to have to politely disagree with that point fairly directly. The argument that the moratorium should be extended because FAA isn't sufficiently resourced just sort of creates this sort of endless loop, right? Where FAA can't get sufficiently resourced because there's a moratorium in place preventing them from looking in more detail, but then the moratorium should be extended further because the FAA doesn't have the resources to do it. That's just an equation for continuously extending the moratorium, and there needs to be a chance where they can all advance together.
Yes, sir.
In light of the last few comments, I just wanted to ask a question of Ben. I mean, is it your view that if the moratorium does expire, that the FAA must regulate immediately, or will there be a period of time in which effectively the current situation will continue in the absence of any regulations? And a second part of that is, is it possible that in that period, the first set of regulations might actually be something similar to where we are now, or be quite limited because there will not be, as an earlier speaker noted, as much information and learning that the industry has already had on how to do this, given the limited number of launches that have happened so far?
Really great question. Really appreciate that. Yeah, we want to emphasize that we think it's the latter case, right? That when the moratorium expires, nothing changes. The world is in a different place on October 2nd if the moratorium expires. There's no regulations that come in place. It takes years to go through that process anyways. And so that certainly wouldn't be the case that there'd suddenly be a whole bunch of regulations in place. We very intentionally in our report don't sort of provide a list of here's a bunch of regulations we recommend. We didn't think that was our place to do. That's something that should be a discussion between FAA and industry and all the other stakeholders involved. And it's a discussion that should take a lot of time, but it's a discussion that has been happening per Megan's point, but also can sort of move on to the next stage of its life where it's not entirely hypothetical anymore. But that said, we're not suggesting that there will be any regulations in place, sort of on October 2nd, if you will, if it expires. And certainly suggesting the opposite, right? If you want my opinion on the matter, there shouldn't be sort of immediate regulations. It's going to take some time to have the conversations and think about what needs to be done. I think one of the points we raise in our report is that a great starting place, per the comments Mike made earlier, is just on the data sharing and data gathering side, right? You can't come up with the right regulations until you have enough information. I mean, I think that's one of the concerns that I'm hearing raised here is that we're not ready. We haven't done this enough yet to know what needs to be done. Absolutely agreed. More information needs to be gathered, but there's also a little more data sharing that comes with that, right? We've talked earlier on this call about how it's challenging sometimes to sort of get out of the silos. Regulatory environment can do that, right? It can create a process by which some of this information can be shared. It doesn't necessarily need to be public sharing, right? It could, so there could be a third party setup where information is shared in a non-public fashion amongst stakeholders, so we can communicate these things. And I think the work being done in ASTM at 47 is a great start to that.
I do want to add to what Ben just said here briefly, if I could, and I want everybody to hear it from me. It is certainly my posture, it is our posture that there is no necessity, there is no must that AST regulate if the moratorium sunsets. I've said it repeatedly, I'll say it again. It is not our posture that we must. I've used the expression, we don't have a file cabinet of regulations ready to go, nothing near it. So I want to reiterate that again. Ben is exactly right. The absence of the sunsetting of the moratorium does not put in place an immediacy of regulations coming around the corner. That is not the case at all.
And just this is Jim. Just two quick pieces. I want to make sure that the correct information was given out. There were 10 people authorized for human spaceflight development. The 40 were for other things. The second piece that I want to mention is we're going to adjust the schedule a little bit. Major General Purdy is on the line, and so when we're done with questions here, we'll move to him, and then we'll take a break for lunch. So with that, John.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Well, first of all, thanks for the report, Ben. I think it's important to point it out that this isn't a binary decision that is, and it has been said 2 or 3 times here, I guess, that once the moratorium sunsets, it's not like there will be instant regulation. It's a multi-year process that will be developed with lots of opportunity to comment on what those regulations might be. And if it doesn't get started at some point, then this will just continue in a process that doesn't lead to regulation at any point. But anyway, I just wanted to foot stomp the idea that just because the moratorium sunsets doesn't mean that we would have regulation instantly. And we need to get the process started so we can eventually get there. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Ben will have to leave us here shortly. So this is your opportunity. Captain DePete, did you have a question? You did not have a question.
Yeah, I did, and I'm sorry, I'm closing up there. Hey, and maybe some of the lawyers on this can help me here. In terms of, the voluntary data action safety programs that we have in aviation, they've been very mature. We've been talking about a lot about data collection here, but we had a long time putting a framework in there that provided the necessary protections, for that data collection that ensured privacy and confidentiality and preserved competitiveness, and all that kind of stuff. So where is that right now, and how do we get there from here without that on the data collection effort? And I'm just throwing it out to anybody who wants to answer that one.
Well, Joe, I'm certainly not the right one to answer it, but I know it is one of the things that I was going to talk with Karina and Jim had about for the safety working group as we tackle that over the rest of the year, which is exactly that. What kind of statutory data protections would go in place for a reporting system? So I think more to be done, right, is my personal opinion.
Right. Hence the, pathway versus the sidewalk at the moment. Right. Because there's a lot of pieces in place that have to be put into place to have a productive program like that. Right. And companies and the individuals that work for these companies need to be assured of those protections. Anyway, thanks.
All right. Any other questions? Comments?
And if
all right.
Later, I'm more than happy to discuss. So feel free to reach out to me either directly or through Jim, and happy to field any questions later.
All right. Thank you, Ben. I greatly appreciate your briefing and answering questions. Thank you so much. Before we do take a break, Major General Purdy is on the line. So just wanted to introduce him briefly. He is quad-hatted as Program Executive Officer for Assured Access to Space, also as Commander Space Launch Delta 45, also Director of Launch and Range Operations, Space Systems Command, and Director of the Eastern Range, Patrick Space Force Base, Florida. He also serves as Space Force University Partnership Program Champion for the University of Texas at Austin. In addition to managing the rapid increase in U.S. space launches and launch providers, he is driving practical innovation implementation with U.S. Space Force's first Spark Cell Base Pitch Day, digital tool, digital headquarters, data, visual IL4 chat, zero trust, supercoders, thin client cloud patches, while exploring air, sea, ground robotics, hackathons, code jams, and building a gaming lounge. He is an incredibly busy commander. He entered the Air Force as a distinguished graduate of the Air Force Reserve Officer Training Corps at Baylor University in 1993 and has served in a variety of engineering and acquisition and policy capabilities and capacities, including assignments at the Air Force Laboratory, Pentagon, Congress, Space and Missile Systems Center, and headquarters, United States Space Force. He has served as an Air Force intern, Space Nuclear Cyber Congressional Appropriations Liaison, materiel leader in the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle Program Manager, and as the Director Special Programs Space and Missile Systems Center. Prior to his current assignment, General Purdy was dual-handed as Space Operations Commander Director, Requirements, Architectures, and Analysis, and the Director, Plans, Programs, and Financial Management. Sir, over to you.
Hey, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone. I know I just have a few minutes, so I thought what would be best for this group is kind of an update on trends, particularly on the launch side. And so broadly speaking, I think we all understand, but I don't think people really understand how much launch is increasing. Every time I do public speaking events and I kind of have people, I quiz people in the audience as to the numbers, they usually get it wrong. So on the Eastern Range, just as a reminder, 2 years ago when I started, we did 31 launches, space launches last year, 57-ish this year, planning on 90. That's insane for anyone that's been around the launch community. There's so much pace and so much activity going on. If you haven't really paid attention to launch in the last 6 months or the range, we've kind of probably outpaced you in terms of where you might think that we're at. The Western is similar, basically doubling the last 2 years, just like the Eastern Range. So it was somewhere on the order of 10, then close to 20, and now close to 40 is what they're going to attempt on the Western Range, which for the Western Range is phenomenal as well. So our policy has generally been, my policy has generally been to don't be in the way. Let the market decide and set up all conditions so that commercial success can be obtained. And that's important from a couple aspects. One is that we're directed by the NDAA to support to the extent that we can. But two, as the DoD moves and changes its architecture to a hybrid architecture, we're going to depend more and more on commercial industry, commercial satellites, commercial data. But we don't know yet which ones. And so as a result on the ranges, the name of the game is throughput. So we want to get as much launch as possible, because I know the rest of my PEO brethren and operations brethren are going to go tap into that capability. But we're doing everything we can to support that, but we're kind of running out of time. We're doing, as we come to an end game here over the next few years, we start to run into different limitations. And so those are key, I think, for everyone to sort of understand. There's 3 big limitations that we kind of started flagging that you'll start seeing in our public products: infrastructure, people, and payload processing, which is an element of infrastructure, but it's uniquely different. On the payload processing, on the Eastern Range, we've got some nice plans to set up payload processing, commercial payload processing on the Cape property itself. There are commercial payload processing folks and plans off base as well. So we think we're in a good direction there. On the Western Range, harder, because not as much commercial there. So we're still struggling to find additional payload processing. We can prove definitively that if we don't set these plans in motion on the Eastern and Western Range, we will run out of payload processing capability for DoD missions alone, let alone commercial. And so that's a known fact. And so we're working hard to get after that. From an infrastructure perspective, our infrastructure on the ranges is 60s era infrastructure supporting, 2023 modern technology and pace. We were very fortunate with OMB dropping about $1.3 billion as a TOA increase to the Department of the Air Force in this year's budget on the Hill. That's basically a huge consolidated list of CE projects on the Western Range and Eastern Range. That's going to basically take care of that issue for the near term. So hopefully that continues to pass on the Hill, and we trend well there. People remains our greatest issue. At some point, we're going to run out of people in time to support commercial launch on the Eastern and Western Range. Our proposed solution to this is the legislative proposal that we put out on the Hill that's now official. There is some discussion of that in industry, which I'm well aware of, and we're happy to engage on that. It basically attempts to get down the road toward normalizing space, just like we would have in the sea and the air domains. Then you'd have a port authority, be it a seaport or airport model. So our goal is to achieve something similar. That would mean range fees. That would be part of that process. Our commitment would be some kind of an open books, so you understand and see where that money's going to. But if we don't have an ability to bring in that income to run Spaceport properly, from a proper business sense underneath DoD control in the Eastern Western Range, we will just simply run out of the ability to support launches. So that's a key aspect and area, and our people have been engaging quite a bit on that topic. Another related issue is pad allocation. We're coming close on the Eastern Range to finishing that. So on the Eastern Range, we did what we call a launch pad allocation. We announced the first one a few months ago with 4 companies based on launch pads. We're working another phase of that one. That first one was small launch focused. This next one will be medium slash heavy slash super heavy focused. And when that's done, we're going to be very, very close to out of pads on the Eastern Range. No more pads available, which is a pretty significant change in how we've always been. The Western Range is doing something similar. They recently went through a process and allocated Slick 6, and there were several bidders, if you will, and they're working additional bids for southern launch locations. They have a little bit more time and runway in space. But the message there is the Eastern Range is almost done doing everything it can do, and then there's no more pads, which is a severe problem because there's only 2 vertical launch Eastern launch locations. I see General Mercer here online. The Wallops location, obviously up with they're great partners, and we're doing everything we can to support them and to max out their throughput as well. But even they'll be tapped out eventually soon. This becomes a national problem. KSC might have some locations, but that's a NASA discussion, and so we stay out of that. But that is definitely a discussion as to what happens after that. We're already getting requests for second, third pads, and we're not going to be able to support all that long term. From a phase 3, from our SPO system acquisition perspective, we're doing everything we can to support everything I just mentioned. So our strategy, which is still in development, broadly though, the strategy is designed to encourage commercial launch, encourage medium launch, encourage launch at other locations like General Mercer's location up there in Wallops, and even open the door for overseas. There's a lot of caveats there and policy that has to be worked, but we don't shut the door. So we're really trying to make sure that our acquisition policy supports all those measures. We also have done some interesting work. We did a lot of analysis to see that, hey, can I launch West Coast missions off the East Coast? And it turns out you can mostly launch West Coast. So then we did the reverse. Can I launch East Coast missions off the West Coast, off of Vandenberg? Fascinatingly, you can actually with only a slight hit. That opens the door to some really interesting long-term discussions. As we've continued to hone safety analysis for the ranges, and as some particular launch providers have got a large number of successful launches, we've been able to narrow the boxes more and more and more. We've obviously got a lot of public and industry and watercraft and aircraft interface with the ranges and that we have to work. And that's going to be a continuing long-term national issue to work, is to make sure that we continue to have access to launch despite the fact that we've got increased watercraft, aircraft, and then mainline commercial air movement. But the West Coast launches provide an interesting, trajectory. If already we're able to reduce some of the safety boxes, and if we can get ourselves to a place nationally where we could perhaps launch with a couple of boats in the water and perhaps a small GA aircraft or 2 in the broad area, can we get to a point where several years down the road and we've got assured flight proven systems on the par of aircraft? Can you get to a point where you can launch Western Range missions over land populations? That possibility starts to be intriguing. And so I would encourage a national level conversation to start the groundwork. Hey, what does that look like? So I've actually asked our safety team. They're like, hey, run me the numbers just out of curiosity. Let's see what that looks like. So I wanted to kind of just, those are all the kind of the key topics to float. We've come so far, so fast. We've managed to solve a lot of our problems, but there's still some heavy problems, the people problem, the increased range problem. So with that, I'll just kind of pause and see if there are any kind of questions or anywhere else that that you would like to tackle. Over.
Any questions for the general? Amanda.
Yes, hi. Good afternoon, General. Just a quick question. Do you think that because of the sanctions against Russia, that these have increased operations at either of the vertical launch facilities?
Yeah, so I'd actually go back a little bit further in time and state that there was a time when launch was fleeing the United States, and it became a national level decision through DoD policy and Title 50, if I remember. No, another title. I just blanked on it, to support space launch in the national and national space from the federal perspective, which opened up cooperation on the ranges, which then kind of led to the development of SpaceX and other new commercial launch enterprises, which then their success begat other successes. I feel like that had more of a sway on creating this huge ramp up than the pure Russian sanction bit. We were impacted by that one, obviously, but we had foreseen that and worked a path to get off the Russian RD-180 engine ourselves from a SPO perspective, which led ULA to develop toward the Vulcan. And I think other companies like Northrop Grumman have worked on that from the Antares perspective, working deals with Firefly, et cetera. So there's been some repercussions from that, but I feel like the broad trend lines are more as a result of national policy driving that cooperation and a huge amount of commercial investments that sees profits in space and is attacking that line by getting after launch and making launch as cheap as possible.
Thank you.
Karina.
General Purdy, thanks so much for being here with us today. Really just a comment, not so much a question, but just a comment. I just wanted to say that I appreciate you engaging with COMSTAC, and I really appreciate your staff, Colonel Horn in particular, Mark Montreger, working closely with industry, engaging with us, and asking questions along the way. It's been really helpful to kind of keep that dialogue going as you're making progress in addressing some of these challenges. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the note. Yeah, we tried something different starting about 1.5 years ago. It was pretty novel. We started talking to people and we found that that's really helpful when you talk to people and you can build alliances. The same thing with OMB and senior levels in the executive branch, which was enabled us to have successful OMB ad and ledge proposals. So absolutely, we welcome the partnerships. And it helps us understand where to focus and to help you all.
Thank you. All right, Jay Skiles. This will be the last question for the morning.
General Purdy, what's going on with the people issues? As you see it, in terms of what are the causes and what are we doing to sort of address that at the ranges?
Yeah, the people issues are mostly driven by the fact of an incredible launch tempo. So it goes back to the fact that how a military base operates. As a reminder, these two launch bases, the Cape and Vandenberg, are on military bases, and they're DoD test ranges. So they operate per normal DoD test range rules. We have a large Air Force base population that manages the base, and then a smaller Space Force population that manages the range. And as customers come onto the range and do tests, like there's a lot of range activity that goes on in the West, not as much on the East. This would be like the Navy or a Missile Defense Agency that comes out. There's money exchange and activity and scheduling that occurs in the normal process. Well, way back in the day, we started to do launch activities. What's changed though is we are funded to essentially do DoD launch, and the DoD launch is about 10 launches a year. We were not prepared nor manned to support launch rates of 90, and I project we're going to be in the multiple hundreds here in a couple of years, easily. Single companies are saying they're going to do 40 and 50 alone, and why that's different is in a normal Air Force base, all the base members, security forces, CE, etc., just kind of do their business of managing the base. Every time an airplane takes off, there's not an active participation run. But for a launch, there is active participation by the security forces and civil engineering and medics and all of these different activities. So that's driving intense manpower constraints. So we have to do like mandatory overtime for security forces and things like that. That's sustainable up to a number. We don't know what that number is. We have some guesstimates and we're trying to get to that number. But that's the people issue. At some point we break because we simply run out of people. And even the little bit of reimbursables that we do, like we'll charge for reimbursables, but all our funding constraints out of law, I can only charge direct costs. I can't charge indirect costs and overhead costs. So I can have my security forces member paid for the time that they're doing roadblocks or escorts, but I can't pay for their training and the rest of the 365 days that they're around. So that's the nature of the people problem. And that's why our solution is to set up a port authority so that we charge a quote landing fee or an existence fee. And then we would pay a contractor force to exist to do all of that work instead of our organic base personnel.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you so much again, General Purdy, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time here at the COMSTAC. Folks, we're going to take a short break. We kind of missed our lunch window from earlier, so we're going to reduce that window a little bit and give you guys a little bit of a break. Just a couple of quick reminders. Please be back here at 1:05 Eastern Time. Please don't log off the Zoom. Just turn off your camera, turn your mute on, just to make sure we can hear you eat your lunch. That way you don't have any trouble signing back in. We missed a couple of AST presentations from the morning session, so we are going to pick up from 1:05 on a couple of those that we've missed, and then we'll go right into the working group discussions. So feel free to take a break for the next 10 minutes or so, and we'll see you back here in a minute.